Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 213. Now I'm most of the way recovered, so you definitely are going to get part 1 in full. Whether or not you get part 2 this week or next weekend is down to how well everything goes. Anyway, Bill Brockman asks, when and how did the Kriegsmarine figure out the Allies were using Hedgehog anti-submarine weapons? It seems like the chance of being hit by one and living to tell the tale would be small, and without being hit by it, they're not going to be aware that it's being used. As for exactly when, it's not entirely clear, but the Kriegsmarine is known to have become aware of the existence of an anti-submarine weapon called Hedgehog fairly soon after its introduction. The reason we don't know exactly, well, at least I don't know exactly when they got that information is because the references that I've got that talk about British intelligence discovering from sources within German intelligence that German intelligence has found out about the Hedgehog mortar system. Although it is attributed specifically in those reports to merchant seamen who presumably had seen the system in action on convoys, talking a little bit too freely in certain ports from which the information had gotten back to the Germans. So, exact date, don't know, but it seems within the first few months of the system's operation. Now, the interesting thing, which the particular source I'm using goes on to relate, is that whilst the Germans knew of the existence of a brand new British anti-submarine weapon called Hedgehog, they didn't know what exactly the capabilities of the Hedgehog were. Probably because it was, second-hand talk from a bunch of merchantmen who'd seen it operating at half-mile to a mile's distance. And so the British, who were obviously looking for ways to try and conceal the existence of some of their other systems, like more finely tuned surface search radar, the use of ultra intelligence and so on and so forth, they decided to play a little game with the Germans whereby they deliberately leaked additional information about Hedgehog, but they made Hedgehog sound a lot more lethal and a lot more dramatic than it actually was. So once they realised the Germans knew that Hedgehog existed, the version of Hedgehog which the Germans subsequently quote-unquote discovered documentation for was a mortar system that could fire far, far further and fired far, far larger charges than Hedgehog, although they didn't edit down the number of charges. So it basically ended up sounding like a 24-barrel limbo or squid launcher, as those things would later turn out to be. And they also threw in the idea that perhaps there was some kind of proximity fuse, an underwater proximity fuse, linked into the Hedgehog system, which, would make it even more spectacularly dangerous. I mean, if you can imagine a system like that, where you're firing 24 full-size depth charges in a spread, and they have some kind of underwater proximity fuse so that they don't even need a direct contact to detonate, well, that would be an absolutely terrifying weapon, and the Germans to a certain extent bought into it, which was exactly what British intelligence wanted them to do, because it then meant that the Germans attributed a good chunk of their suddenly rising losses in 1943 and to a certain extent late 42, they began to attribute them to this wonder weapon Hedgehog launcher, when in fact it was a whole combination of things, including the Hedgehog launcher. But then if the Germans didn't know about all the others, they couldn't develop countermeasures to them. Texas and LaShock asks, following up on my question about the bombardment of Fort McHenry, you said that fuses for the bombs are ignited when they're fired. I started wondering how reliable that was, and were there occasions where the bomb would be fired but the fuse not lit? And who was responsible for determining where they wanted the bomb to detonate, calculating how long it would take the projectile to reach that position, determining how long the fuse would need to be, and trimming it down to that length? And what determines if you light the fuse and then launch it, or light it via firing? So whether or not you lit the fuse, then stuck it in a mortar and fired it, or whether you trusted the mortar to light the fuse, basically depended on the kind of mortar and the kind of shell you had. As time went on, the ignited by firing method basically became universal, because, well, you can understand the unreliability issues with having something that you had to light, then chuck in the mortar, then fire. So that was only a somewhat earlier thing. Now, as far as the other bits are concerned, were there occasions where the bomb would be fired but the fuse not lit? Yes. Clearing up dud mortar shells was a perennial hazard of any shore bombardment if you happen to win, and, well, a perennial hazard for people who manage to successfully resist a shore bombardment as well, because you've got to remember, just because it may not be lit doesn't mean the thing's not very, very hot when it lands. So in terms of determining where the bomb detonates, how long it's going to take to get there, how you cut the fuse, etc., that would be the responsibility of the gunner-in-chief, who was in charge of the mortar. And officially, there was a book. So the book would tell you if you had a mortar that had a variable angle, what the different ranges at different angles were, or if it was a fixed mortar and you had to vary the range using different charges, then what ranges you could achieve using different charges. And if you were really lucky and you had a mortar that could take both variable charges and you could vary the angle of, then obviously you had to combine the two. That would then tell you, if you're firing a mortar at, let's say, 45 degrees with a full charge, then it will go X distance and it'll take Y time to get there. You'd then cut the fuse accordingly. Unofficially, of course, in the middle of combat, a lot of people they might start off with some book-made readings, but if they're either experienced or they're under time pressure, very often people would just go with, rule of thumb or experience as to how to cut things. And then, of course, obviously all of that was dependent on the fuse igniting at the correct point when you fired it. If the fuse ignited a little bit further down, then it might end up detonating early, which would happen semi-regularly, which is why you'd have a lot of these things detonating high up in the air. Now, the mortar bombs detonating high up in the air wasn't necessarily a glitch. People did occasionally want to do that as a kind of bombardment because it would shower hot shrapnel down on things. But there's a difference between something detonating 20, 30 foot off the ground and having a nice shrapnel and concussive effect, possibly an incendiary effect, which is what you want, and one that detonates 300 foot up in the air and doesn't really do an awful lot. Nick Brodar asks, any truth to the story that Admiral King promoted the Navy grey uniform because he thought khakis looked too much like the Army uniform, and that they were primarily confined to the Atlantic because Admiral Nimitz hated them and discouraged their wear? Both claims are attested to in a number of different sources. Admiral King saying that, the khaki, which, to be fair, the khaki at that point had only just been introduced, but yeah, he did think it looked a bit too much like an army set of uniforms, although weirdly enough, one of the two main reasons ostensibly given for the introduction of the grey uniform was that they would therefore be more in line with the Army and Air Force in terms of simplicity, if not necessarily colour. And in terms of being confined to the Atlantic, yes, again, Admiral Nimitz is known to have not particularly liked the grey. I don't know exactly why. I think it looks quite snazzy. But anyway, apparently Admiral Nimitz didn't like it, to the extent that although it was official US Navy uniform for over half a decade, he apparently never got a set of navy greys. And then he would abolish them completely in 1949. They were also relatively slow to be produced, which might also explain part of the reason they were confined to the Atlantic Fleet. Various individual Pacific Fleet officers did have grey uniforms, which obviously they'd had created whilst they were in the States before shipping out. But there was this kind of unofficial, Admiral Nimitz doesn't like them, so probably don't get caught wearing them if you have an alternate dress uniform, one of the older ones, going on in the Pacific. But with that said, you can find the occasional picture of somebody in the Pacific Fleet in World War II who is quite clearly wearing some kind of grey uniform, as opposed to the dress blues, which we more commonly associate with US Navy smartwear. Send Penguins asks, what was the evolution of the machinist rank in the US Navy? I'd always assumed it was a version of what's currently the LDO or CWO track in the Navy, and grew out of the scarcity of mechanically trained personnel in the 19th century, but I've realised the rank seems more general by the time of World War II. Well, you're correct on its origins. The rank of originally machinist took over from the rank of finisher in the 1880s, then in the mid-1890s, it went back to being finisher again, and then in the mid-1900s, it went over to being Machinist Mate, which is where it stands now. As you can see, there's the rank on the right-hand side of this picture. But you are correct, it is something of a catch-all term. In fact, going by the Navy's current descriptions, and bear in mind, obviously, how this retroactively works back into the World War I and World War II Navy, the duties performed by machinist mates include aligning piping systems for oil, water, air and steam, the controlling of the operation of ship's boilers and steam turbines used for ship propulsion and service systems, and they control the operation of turbo generators used to produce electrical power. Machinist mates clean, adjust, test and perform other preventative maintenance on a ship's boilers, main engines, turbo generators and other auxiliary machinery, including steering engines, elevators, winches, pumps and associated valves. They operate and maintain desalination plants to make fresh water from seawater and maintain refrigeration plants, air conditioning systems and galley equipment. Machinist mates repair and replace valves, pumps, heat exchangers, compressors, steam turbines and hydraulic or pneumatic control devices. They also maintain and analyse machinery operating records and reports. So essentially, if it goes whir, hum or tsh and isn't a nuclear reactor, a machinist mate in the US Navy will have something to do with it, both in terms of service and repair and in alignment and making sure it doesn't need service and repair quite so often. And as such, it could become a very, very generalist rank, because a machinist mate might be needed to, say, service the rotation motor for a radar on a World War II battleship. He might also be aligning the feed water pipes and valves down in the engine room. He might be maintaining and servicing the portable damage control pumps, or he might be, head first down the mechanics of one of the ship's laundry's washing machines, and anything and everything else in between, including, things like motors that drive the turrets, elevate the guns, and so forth. So, yeah, it's a very generalist rank, but an incredibly important one, because without it, all this other fancy technology tends to grind to a screeching halt. In terms of its rank evolution, it basically starts off as a rank of, here, there are some complicated mechanical parts to our ships nowadays, therefore you must fix them and maintain them, back in the day where there may only literally have been a handful of specific systems. But as those systems or derivatives of them grew more and more complex and more widespread across ships, the machinist mates just followed them around. Bruce Kiernan asks, what was the best destroyer class of World War I? Is there something comparable to the Fletcher Swarm of World War II? And how do the Wickes-Clemson classes rate in 1920? It's a little difficult to judge, because how you classify the best destroyer really probably depends on what specifics you're using to make that judgment. So if you want to, say, use most widespread destroyer that saw the most active useful service and was very capable in that service, then something like the M class, which between various subvariants had 94 ships produced, would probably be the best bet, because at least the first batches are in service at the beginning of the war. They are fairly modern, fairly large ships for World War I. They have 3 4-inch guns and 2 twin torpedo launchers, and they get built in a number of wartime emergency flotillas, but they don't last too long after the war. Conversely, if you look at sheer capability, the V&W class, which only just about start to make it in 1918, are considerably more capable ships. They have 4 4-inch guns, so they pretty much have the standard interwar destroyer armament. They have a heavier torpedo armament. They're relatively large, so they can absorb a certain amount of modification, and they actually, a good chunk of them will actually serve on through into World War II. Now, that longevity makes them very successful in another way, but in terms of World War I, they're basically not there, except for the very, very closing stages. So, are they the best destroyer class of World War I? Perhaps on paper, but in terms of actually usefully affecting World War I, definitely not. The German destroyer designs of various descriptions partially suffer because the Germans went in, for the most part, for much smaller designs, which made them individually usually somewhat less capable. And, of course, in the immediate aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles, the vast majority of them got scrapped. So even if they had given relatively decent service in World War I, they didn't have much, if any, opportunity to give decent service thereafter. And a lot of other people were, scrapping and completely getting rid of their World War I destroyer fleets in the post World War I situation, because it was basically only the Germans and the British who were going absolute full tilt at building and iterating new destroyer classes en masse during the war, pretty much because they had to. Most other nations either didn't build destroyers during that period, or if they did, they built relatively small classes thereof. So yeah, it's kind of a circumstance limited, but either the V&W or the M's would be my personal choice. The M's are about as close as you get to the Fletcher Swarm, but there aren't quite as many of them. As far as the Wicks and Clemson's class in the 1920s are concerned, they are actually remarkably powerful ships. They're very large, they're very fast, they carry a very heavy armament. They are kind of almost like a French contre-torpilleur is as compared to everybody else's destroyers in the late 1930s, except that there's dozens and dozens and dozens of them. In many ways, they are pretty much the epitome of that period's destroyer design. It's just that they then obviously get put into mothballs in vast numbers until you get to a period where they are at the other end of the scale of destroyer development, simply because of the time period that they're built in. Trevorius asks, breech-loading guns from the 14th and 15th centuries. They had a higher rate of fire, but issues with sealing them saw them ultimately beaten out by slower but more powerful single-piece muzzle loaders. With the benefit of modern knowledge and hindsight, is there any way, using the technology of the time, that the issues of these early breech loaders could have been solved, or at least sufficiently ameliorated, such that they could have remained in frontline service? In theory, to a certain degree. The problem is that that would require a fair degree of complexity, to the point that I don't think it would be practical. You could make a relatively rapidly loading, well-sealed breech loader, but it would be a kind of an artisan piece, so not something that you could replicate en masse for distribution across a fleet, and it would probably work just fine on a test mount and probably break at some point while it was at sea. Even in the 1850s, they were still having issues with gas leakage around breech loading guns. So, fixing that in the Tudor period, much more difficult. There are a number of other problems that you have when it comes to at least the Tudor style of breeches. You can see here. You can see the entire breech block is a separate piece that lifts out. Now, that in and of itself introduces issues in terms of how large you can make the gun, because with a muzzle loading gun, the single greatest weight that you have to worry about is the weight of the shot itself. So if you can lift and maneuver the shot and get it into the gun, then the gun can be that big. Whereas with the old style breech loader, the whole breech weighs a fair bit, and then you've got to put the entire thing, so charge, shot, and wadding into the breech. So that breech now has all of that weight in it, plus its own weight. Then you've got to get it back in to the gun itself. And that is going to significantly limit it, because we know the Royal Navy a little bit further down the line would have 42 plus pounders in service, but only for a little while. But let's say we standardize on the 32 pounder ball, which is, what became the standard for the Royal Navy for a fairly long period in the Age of Sail. Under this setup, if you've got the charge and then the wadding and then the 32 pounder ball, you're probably already looking at 40 to 50 pounds weight, which isn't too bad. Probably it's viable But then all of that's going in the breech. The breech itself is probably going to weigh at least 60 pounds plus. So you're now talking about an all-up weight of well over 100 pounds. And as, well, even navies in World War II would find, 100-pound weight, or 100 plus pounds combined weight, is not something that's easily man-portable. Certainly not in a seaway. And therefore you very rapidly start to run into problems with trying to make this thing a viable weapon at all, and you'd lose certainly the rate of fire, any rate of fire advantage you might have, because it's going to take a bit of a struggle and a lot of very careful work with probably a bunch of men and some strong poles just to get this thing into position. Then you've actually got to, wedge it into position, because that's the way these breeches work. You put it up against the back of the barrel, and then you use a big wooden wedge to hammer the two together and hope that you don't get too much of a gas leak. And then you've got to detach the thing and repeat the process. So I don't think those are problems that, with the technology of the period, you can overcome, except by inventing a very basic swinging breech. Possibly with a kind of very, very simple screw lock, but as I said, that would be a kind of master artisan piece, not something that could be easily multiplied and replicated across a fleet. The other problem you have is that although in theory this kind of system is faster firing, that relies on you having multiple breeches to be able to swap in and out, which most of the time you don't actually have. And it also relies on your barrel being able to sustain the heat buildup associated with repeated firings, which again is not something it can really do. So if you were going to do it, then yes, as I said, with a very, very primitive screw breech and a hinged swing, you probably could make a relatively rapid firing breech loading cannon in the 15th or 16th centuries. But I think it would have to be a very large gun, just so you just got the sheer thermal mass of the barrel to absorb the heat of repeated firings, and it would almost certainly have to be a fixed piece or possibly rotating piece mounted in a major coastal fortification to allow you to get any kind of significant use out of the one or two that you'll probably be able to manufacture. Crack Muppet asks, if by hook or by crook there'd been more consistent admiral in tactical command, particularly after the First Battle of Savo Island, how much better would things have gone for the light forces of the US Navy? Probably your best bet would have been for Admiral Scott to be given a semi-permanent command of US operational light forces in the area. Bear in mind that he'd had a front row seat to Savo Island. He'd then fought his own battle and his own night action with the Japanese, and he was in the process of tabulating a method for US Navy night fighting, obviously based on his recent experiences at the time when he was killed while he was aboard USS Atlanta. So if he had been instead put in charge of that particular formation, well then obviously, hopefully would not have get himself killed. I mean, theoretically, yes, Admiral Callahan also got himself killed, who was in command, but Scott definitely isn't going to be making the same tactical decisions as Callahan, which probably one would hope would keep him alive. And of course, the more night actions he fights and the more he's able to develop his prototype night battle doctrine, the better the US Navy becomes and the more likely it becomes that more people stay alive, which is always a good thing. So, and there's also a consistency of command there, so people know what they're doing. Because when you look at the various US night actions in the Guadalcanal campaign, when you end up with different admirals going in, you pretty much see a universally similar approach, which is everybody form a conga line and sail onwards until something happens, which usually doesn't work out too well in the face of the Japanese formations, which tend to be a bit more flexible, a bit more spread out, and a bit more used to night fighting. And occasionally, you do have victories, they do win through, but that's partly attributable to Japanese failures as much as it is US successes, or the particular remarkable genius of certain officers like Admiral Lee. So, yeah, there's always going to be a degree of unpredictability in night actions, or any kind of reduced visibility action, but a consistent officer who's already laying the groundwork for a new night fighting doctrine, leading fight after fight after fight, is much more likely to preserve a number of US assets that would otherwise end up being lost, and very likely also cause significantly more casualties for the Japanese. So the first night action of Guadalcanal, as I said, probably would go a bit better, and something like Tassafaronga definitely isn't going to go down the way it did historically. Rebel Skvirl asks, in the early 19th century, the USA built an extensive series of coastal fortifications to guard its cities and seaports, resources that could have been put into building a larger navy. In your opinion, would the US have been better off doing the latter instead, or were the forts a valid expenditure, given the significant role they played in several engagements during the American Civil War? Early 19th century USA is one of those edge cases where I actually find myself, if not necessarily fully in favour of building shore fortifications, at least a lot more understanding of the construction of shore fortifications as compared to my normal stance, which is that the vast majority of shore fortifications are pointless wastes of money, compared to, putting those resources into an actual navy. And that's because in the context of the US political environment in the first half of the 19th century, post-War of 1812, i.e. very isolationist, they make a little bit more sense, because the US wasn't going to be sending a large fleet overseas to do much of anything apart from, go and blow up the occasional Barbary pirate, and as they showed, they had the fleet capable of doing that already. And then you have to think again that the US is in a very unique tactical situation, more strategic situation more likely, because unlike most of the nations of Europe and other associated areas where you could have any number of enemy show up off your coastline at relatively short notice of any kind of relative differences in strength, the US being on the other side of the Atlantic meant that pretty much the only people who were going to bother to send a force of any significant size all the way across the Atlantic and have, the capability of sustaining them there was going to be one of the big players, France, Spain, Britain, etc. And if you manage to annoy one of those, well, the latter stages of the War of 1812, particularly during 1814, kind of pointed out how much of a issue this could be for the US, because they could show up with so many ships of so many different sizes that there was no way any US Navy could actually realistically fend them off. Now, some of the early plans in the 1820s and latter part of the 1810s did try to come up with a disruption fleet theory, which is why the various US-74s and the USS Pennsylvania were built. But even with those, it became fairly obvious fairly quickly that whilst, yes, USS Pennsylvania might be able to outshoot, at least in terms of sheer weight of metal, almost any first-rate then currently in production, again, you return to the problem of if you are having an opponent come after you who's big enough to send a fleet across the Atlantic in the first place, the chances are they'll send 3 or 4 first rates, at which point the fact that you're better one-on-one doesn't really matter all that much. Whereas with extensive fortifications, at that point it didn't matter how big or how small the enemy fleet was, you couldn't ignore it, you couldn't bypass it, and it would be a lot harder to knock out and disable a well-built fort than an individual ship. Thus, the forts were probably a valid expenditure, given the sheer size of the US coast, which is the other thing to bear in mind. In the age of sail, when it might take weeks, if not months, for even a relatively strong US Navy to sail from, say, New York to New Orleans, then even if you had a relatively strong fleet, you would need something to hold out to avoid, them showing up to find the port in question in enemy hands. So as far as a series of positions from which to fight delaying actions and positions from which to try and hold off the enemy, or at least make yourself too much of hard work to actually be worth attacking, then for the very particular set of circumstances that Age of Sail United States found itself in the first half of the 19th century, the forts are probably just about a decent bet, especially if you can't guarantee continual funding for maintenance of a fleet, which is basically what happened to most of the US capital ships during the 1820s and 1830s and then 1840s. They end up basically being unfunded and sitting around as accommodation ships or never quite complete. A Salty Potato asks, you've talked at length several times about the 5-inch 38 gun, both about how good it was and about how it wasn't as great at longer distance surface engagements. Would it have been possible to increase the calibre of the barrel to give it better ballistics at range, or would such a modification cause an engineering rabbit hole where to get the performance increase out of a longer barrel you need to modify the projectile, increase the amount of powder, redesign the entire breech, etc.? In theory, it's entirely possible to give the 5-inch gun a longer barrel. I mean, the 5-inch 38 actually represents an effort to do just that, considering that initially the US anti-aircraft weapon was the 5-inch 25, and such a barrel extension for a 5-inch caliber gun would actually happen again because you get the 5-inch 54 in the immediate aftermath of World War II. However, there is a rather large issue and a slightly smaller secondary one when it comes to extending the barrel of the 5-inch 38. The smaller secondary one is spacing. If you have a shorter barrel weapon, then you can fit more of them in a confined space. A longer barrel weapon, you need more room to be able to swing them around. So if you had to space them out further, then you can't fit quite as many on a given sized vessel, so you probably end up with fewer guns, or possibly guns in more compromised fire arcs, or even if you have exactly the same number of guns with similar or even possibly better fire arcs, you will have sacrificed space for other things like 20 and 40mm guns. The much larger issue, however, is weight. And that, more than anything else, would probably dictate that you'd have to lose guns. And it's not just the increased weight of the barrel, because the weight also has a certain amount of force that it exerts depending on where it is relative to the balance point. So if you have a longer barrel gun, then the point of rotation is going to be further along that weapon. So your positioning is going to have to change. The breech is probably going to extend further back into the mounting, which is going to make the mounting larger, or if you want to keep the mounting the same size, and therefore proportionally the barrel is going to extend further out of the gun turret of the either turret or mounting openings, then you're going to have counterbalances, in which case obviously that's going to have an even greater increase on overall weight, because you've now got the greater weight of the gun and the weight of the counterbalance itself. The mounting itself, because you're going to have a long barrel weapon with more recoil and the whole thing obviously it just weighs more, the mounting is going to have to be stronger, which means it's going to have to be slightly larger, which means it's going to weigh more. And then all of that means that your gun is going to be slower moving. So it's going to become an inferior anti-aircraft weapon because it can't track and elevate quite as quickly. You're going to have problems with the loading mechanism, because if it's got more recoil because it's a longer barrel weapon, then you're going to need a deeper gun pit or more heavily beefed up recoil absorption mechanisms, and all of those mechanisms are going to be heavier. And obviously the amount of time it takes to dissipate the recoil energy is also going to affect how quickly you can load, aim and fire the gun. And if you've got a heavier gun, counterweights, heavier mountings, beefed up recoil mechanisms, etc., then that means that and you want to have at least decent anti-aircraft performance, that means the motors that rotate the turret and elevate the guns all have to be bigger and beefier and chunkier, and therefore the gun house and the floor, etc., has to be stronger to support that. And so in the end, just for the what might seem to be the apparent increase of a small amount to increase the barrel length, you actually end up adding a huge amount more weight to retain something approximating the same kind of capability, at which point multiply that up across multiple mounts and you are almost near enough certainly going to have to sacrifice at least one mounting on a typical US battleship, which means you're going to end up with a layout that's more akin to British battleships at the time, where they have 4 twin secondaries on either side rather than the 5 that the US do. So yeah, you can do it. You can basically get the 5-inch 54 early, but you're going to have to make a number of sacrifices. Even if theoretically each mount remains just as capable, the number of mounts is therefore going to drop, and therefore you can have a less capable anti-aircraft suite. Meatwad asks, why did Admiral Nishimura not wait for Admiral Shima at Surigao Strait, and would it have made a difference? Largely on the basis that the Japanese forces were travelling under strict emissions control, which meant that once Admiral Shima and Admiral Nishimura's forces became detached, there was no way of knowing where they'd gone, or how long it would take them to get there, or where they were at the time, or if they were even still alive. Yes, in theory, all of those problems could have been solved by just radioing the Nachi, which was Admiral Shima's flagship, and going, yeah, we kind of waiting for you here. But with orders not to do that, then, well, you could stick around and hope that they found you, but there was no guarantee that that was going to happen, or that if it was going to happen, that it would happen in good time. And so, well, at that point, you might as well proceed. So it's kind of a failure from right on high in the terms of the planning the operation, where the operation assumed that everybody would stick together and be able to stick together throughout the entirety of the operation, which turned out to be not the case. Now, would it have made a difference? In the overall scheme of things, no. Admiral Shima's force, he had a bunch of cruisers and destroyers, is not enough to tip the balance at the Battle of Surigao Strait in a way that makes it a Japanese victory. The Japanese ships are all going to either have to sink or retreat. However, it could potentially make a difference in the details, because if you have his reinforcements of several cruisers and destroyers, and they're able to deploy ahead of Fuso and Yamashiro, there is a much greater chance of them intercepting the incoming US attacks that initially take out one of the 2 battleships. And if they've got both battleships available and then they forged their way deeper into Surigao Strait, given that a good chunk of the gauntlet of fire that those ships initially ran was USPT boats, destroyers and cruisers, if you've got Japanese cruisers and destroyers available in and it's a small amount of reasonable numbers able to fight back, then again that may draw a significant amount of US attention. They will eventually get chewed down and spat out, but it would mean that the battleships have somewhat less pressed. The battleships themselves are somewhat less pressed, so they may be able to give supporting fire to their smaller brethren, which again might help them try and fight their way through. They're still going to come up against 7th Fleet, and that's still a dramatically losing proposition, but they might come up against it in something vaguely approximating slightly better condition, which means they might be able to put up a bit more of a fight, rather than just acting as kind of, oh, it's a nighttime live fire exercise, which for the US battleships is pretty much what it ended up being. So I wouldn't say it would make it a close fought battle, but it would make it a battle wherein the US Navy might actually sustain a number of casualties before the Japanese force is completely destroyed, as opposed to historically where basically it was a bit of a shooting gallery. Ryan Frederick asks, it's very difficult, I think, to get a sense of scale when reading that a ship took a hit from another ship, or to visualize the capabilities of shore bombardment. What does the explosion of a battleship caliber shell actually look like? I understand the bigger the gun, the bigger the boom, but what is it comparable to in terms of explosive power? Well, I mean, it depends quite a lot on what kind of shell is being flung around. An HE shell is going to carry several hundred pounds of explosive and is therefore going to look considerably more spectacular in terms of just boom as compared to an armor-piercing shell, which at best is going to carry a few dozen pounds of explosive. However, there is also another thing to take into account. So here you can see HMS Hood obscured by a number of fairly large splashes, and you can see all sorts of pictures available on the internet of battleship caliber shell splashes coming down, and this isn't exactly atypical for the kind of splashes and water spouts that you see. Now this is all very impressive, but a direct hit by a functioning armor-piercing shell to an enemy capital ship actually looks far less spectacular, because this is obviously a set of shells that have hit the water, exploded, and displaced a large amount of water around them. If a shell hits a target and it penetrates that target, assuming, of course, that we don't blow up a magazine or something else very similar, it's going to be several dozen feet inside the enemy capital ship when it explodes. And for all the fact you definitely don't want to be near 30-40 pounds of high explosive when it detonates, 30 to 40 pounds or 15 to 20 pounds, depending on the kind of shell we're talking about, is not a huge amount of explosive in the grand scheme of military explosives. The difference when it comes to naval shells, particularly battleship grade armor-piercing shells, is that they also, when they explode, obviously detonate and propel large amounts of very hot metal, 1,000+ pounds or 2,000+ pounds in the case of US Mark 8s of high-grade steel is suddenly converted into a lot of fragments, including some fairly large fragments, all of which are moving at very high velocity. And this more than anything else is what will rip apart, tear down things in a storm of steel. So whilst a battleship's HE shell might be comparable to a 500-pound bomb, if it's a general purpose bomb that's chucked downrange, an armor-piercing shell actually has, as I said, a relatively small amount of explosive, but it does a lot of its damage via a very different mechanism to just conventional artillery bombardment. And even if it does a significant amount of damage that isn't a magazine detonation, because all of this tends to happen inside the ship, from an exterior perspective, it can actually be sometimes relatively difficult to determine that a hit has even been scored, unless and until you see the slightly odd cloud of debris rising. So you'll remember from the Seydlitz video that, as battered as Seydlitz looked, apart from the torpedo impact, none of the individual impacts looked that large. But when I was describing the hits, I was pointing out that some of the internal holes in the deck were considerably larger than the external holes, and therefore a lot more damage had been done. And so this is actually one of a number of reasons why the British thought they'd done a lot more damage than they actually had. Now, I have explained this before, but it does bear repeating. One of the reasons when you read a lot of the initial British reports, up to and including 1919, where they think that they've sunk multiple German battleships at Jutland, comes from the fact that they are aware that if you hit an enemy target with in this case a 12, 13.5 or 15-inch shell, you might see a small flash and a small rising column of smoke. But if that shell has gone in, as I said, not detonated magazine, but done some other serious damage inside, that's probably all you're going to see. When the British shells hit and they're actually exploding a lot closer to the surface of the vessel in question, or even on contact, what they are perceiving is a considerably larger flash and a considerably larger pool of smoke than they're used to, because the shells are detonating at or just inside the hull skin of the ship. But they don't know that that's happening. They're thinking the shell has hit. Well, they've seen it hit, so obviously it will have penetrated as far as it should do. And therefore, if you're seeing this size of flash, this size of fire, this amount of smoke from a hit that's several dozen meters into the ship, that means something's gone seriously wrong. We're talking magazine fires or exploded boilers, even if something hasn't detonated, or ready-use ammunition fires or something. Therefore, that must be, catastrophic damage to the ship. Combined with the fact that German ships tended to heel over a fair bit when they made a turn, from the British perspective, they're seeing what appear to be a series of catastrophically devastating hits coupled with ships turning away with a heavy list, and they're concluding, yes, well, obviously we must have gutted the interior of the ship, and it's flooding quite quickly and it'll go down very soon, therefore we can chalk that one up as a kill. Whereas, as I just explained, in actual fact, it was because of dodgy shells that were giving a misleading visual impression. So, yeah, this is what actually visualizing a battleship caliber shell hit that works properly is not that impressive from a long distance view. And when you look at the hit, for example, to Giulio Cesare, and even in the initial few seconds, the hit to Hood, people become aware that a hit has been scored because they discern a puff of debris and smoke. But as for exactly what effect that's had, it's not usually all that clear until some point thereafter, either because of magazine catch fire and everything goes up, or people get a settled down view or aerial recon view or whatever. But the external appearance of these hits is usually not that impressive. It's obviously a lot more impressive if you're right up close and personal with that hit, or if it's a hour-long demolition of a ship like Hiroshima or Bismarck, then those hits start to become progressively more and more obvious and progressively more and more spectacular. Capitano Lorenzo asks, Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nagumo, First Savo Island, Admiral Mikawa, and the Battle of Samar, Admiral Kurita. In all three of these epic naval engagements, the Japanese Navy had the US Navy on the ropes with the potential of a truly smashing victory, and yet, in all three battles, instead of pressing forward aggressively and smartly, all three admirals backed off. Is this not in direct contrast with the Kantai-Kessen decisive battle doctrine? These men were no cowards, but in my view Nagumo was too conservative, and Kurita, solely in my opinion, knew the war was lost and desired not to throw his men away in what could have been ultimately a futile effort. Would it have not been more in line with Japanese Navy battle doctrine for all three admirals to have pressed forward despite any consequences? So I think part of it comes from the fact that going in, they are all very aware that Japan is basically playing catch-up. Japan is a little bit on the back foot compared to the US Navy, and to be honest, during most of the conflicts, they're also fighting the British and various others. So they're aware the Japanese Navy is outnumbered. And as a result, that does play into certain decisions and how you would actually, play off aggressiveness in certain battles, because a Navy where you're going in confident of not necessarily having overwhelming numbers, but at least confident of, if we lose X number of ships, we probably can get replacements in from somewhere, and it'll be worth it if we can inflict equal or better damage on the enemy in so doing. That will incline the mind of officers in one way, whereas if you go into a conflict or a particular battle knowing that there is nothing to replace your ships if they are lost, and we're not talking about just in terms of in the theatre, we're talking about period, there just aren't, that will prey differently on the minds of the naval officers who are involved in that particular conflict. And I think that's probably most evident with Mikawa. Admittedly, also Admiral Mikawa was given completely false intelligence, but if Mikawa had been a US Navy or Royal Navy officer, and Guadalcanal had been being invaded by the Japanese, I guess, in that case, considering it's the Pacific, I think if you're in charge of ultimately what are mostly older ships, so that would be the equivalent, roughly equivalent formation would be maybe some Omahas and a Pensacola or two, or some, say, the D's and the E's with a county or two. And you have Admiral McCarrier, say, in the US or British navies, and he's all right there. You've just blown straight through an enemy cruiser screen. Congratulations, well done. Now, your objective was to destroy the transports, but by this point, if you go on and attack the transports, you may well be subject to significant air attack come daybreak. For the better US and British admirals, they'd look at it and go, well, we've already more than sunk our own tonnage in shipping, so that's good. If we then round it out by taking out the enemy landing forces, then the enemy landings, which are the big problem, are dealt with, and they're not going to come back for a while. And then, yes, we may be subject to air attack. We might not be. We might still get away. But even if we are, and even if our ships are damaged or even sunk, overall, this is still a positive trade for us. And, we can have more ships built in the area before the enemy can, especially if we set back their landing chances. So it's worth going in. Whereas for Makawa, he's looking at it and thinking, even if I destroy the enemy landing ships, which is going to put my kill-death ratio, both in terms of tonnage and hull numbers, way, way into the positive, even if all of that happens, if I get sunk, we don't have anything to replace this mixture of light and heavy cruisers that I have. And so when the enemy, which I know has more ships than us, turns up to do something else, maybe another landing or some kind of revenge attack, we just won't be able to stop them. Therefore, I need to be a bit more conservative in how I, use my vessels. It is a huge, the overall strategic situation is a huge thing to have in the back of the mind of any admiral. The other thing is that Japanese battle doctrine is actually paradoxically hilariously conservative and hilariously profligate at the same time. Yes, the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive engagement, calls for an all-out effort, no holds barred, take them down any which way you can, but simultaneously it means that any engagement that isn't that decisive battle, any and all forces must be conserved as much as humanly possible in order for as many forces as possible to be present for that decisive battle later on. Which, obviously, in all of these cases has, again, a certain amount of mitigating influence on the Admiral's decision-making. I know it might seem a bit weird that, but by the time of the Battle of Samar, people are still thinking in terms of, but when we fight that big decisive battle, but in some elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy, they are still doing so, even though that big decisive battle had probably been fought at the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant William Bush asks, in The British Battleship, page 345, Friedman mentions Operation Catherine, Churchill's 1940 plan to send 3 QEs into the Baltic in a rather vaguely described mission. On page 348, there is a similar plan to modify 2 Rs because they will be needed next year, 1941, for the attack on Italy. Can you provide some further information into these 2 projected operations? So Operation Catherine was the idea to send a large British contingent, including carrier cruisers and destroyers, but mostly centred around battleships, into the Baltic. There was a twofold strategy here, part of which was to destroy and otherwise deny German access to Swedish iron ore exports, but also by pushing themselves into the Baltic, it would force the German fleet to come out and play. So the idea was that it would hopefully completely eliminate any major German surface assets, at which point even the loss of the Royal Navy Task Force was considered acceptable, because if the Germans lost basically their entire surface navy, even if the British lost a good third of their navy, well, they still had 2/3 of a navy left to fight everybody else, and the Germans and their surface threat would be completely done for, which would enable the remaining British ships to actually concentrate in theoretically greater quantities against other threats than they would even without the loss of the task force if the German fleet was still extant. The attack on Italy was somewhat more prosaic. It was just a case of hoping to directly assault Italy after it had joined the war, in a series of bombardments and landings, which eventually obviously did happen, but wouldn't happen for another couple of years after Churchill thought. Now, with the latter one, there it's very definitely R-class that are planned for it. For the former one, it depends on what stage of Operation Catherine you're looking at. Initially, Operation Catherine is supposed to be a bunch of, as you mentioned, QEs with some minimal upgrades to their anti-aircraft defences, but as it bounces along before Churchill eventually gives up, it actually transitions over into being more and more heavily modified R-class. The basic premise was that a fleet that heads into the Baltic, or a fleet off of the Italian coast, will be subjected to intense air attack, and there is no way to stop that air attack from getting through. Even if you have carriers, the carrier aircraft, there won't be enough fighters to stop an enemy large land-based air force in its own backyard. And also, if you're operating right off the enemy coast, it was presumed that the enemy aircraft would be bringing the heaviest bombs they could to the party, so the range and payload considerations that would affect a aircraft that had to head several hundred miles out to sea wouldn't be in effect. So if the enemy is going to break through and they are going to be carrying the heaviest possible weapons, then in order for the ships to survive as long as possible, they need to be modified to take those kinds of hits. And kind of the ultimate example of the plans for the R-class was to refit them with huge bulges, almost monitor-style bulges, to be able to take multiple airdrop torpedo attacks, but also to just literally slap on 4 inches of deck armour. So the bulges would give them a huge amount more buoyancy, which would allow them to navigate narrower channels. The guns would need to be modified so they could fire at a higher angle, which would give them better shore bombardment capability. But as I say, the decks, and we're not talking internal work, we're literally talking the external deck, just slapping 4 inches of steel on top of it all, which would, to a certain extent, counteract the extra buoyancy given by the bulges. But the idea was that this 4-inch deck on the exterior could no-sell basically any general-purpose bomb that could be dropped on it, and even in the case of an armour-piercing bomb, like a 1,000-pounder or 2,200-pounder, well, a 1,000-pounder against 4 inches of deck armour might still be stopped, but if you had an armour-piercing 2,200-pounder like was dropped on, say, Illustrious in the Mediterranean, then it might get through this upper level of deck armour, but it would definitely be detonating shortly thereafter, at which point the ship's conventional deck armour would stop any residual splinters and explosion, at which point the ship's citadel is preserved and the ship can continue fighting. The downside to all of this is, of course, that the ship is slowed down to about 13 knots and isn't therefore going to be going anywhere fast, but it was one of those ideas where everybody kind of nodded and went, yes, Prime Minister, very good idea, Prime Minister. But in more urgent terms, considering it's going to take us 18 months to refit these ships, would you mind looking at these instead? And eventually, by a series of reflections, hoping that he would forget. Greb asks, Jane's fighting ships in 1917 said that the US Navy went back from steam turbines to vertical triple expansion engines for USS Texas to make a point to manufacturers. Do you know anything about this? So I wouldn't say it was strictly about making a point to the manufacturers, but you do have to consider the context. When Texas was being initially designed, the US had 0 operational dreadnoughts, and therefore 0 operational experience running dreadnoughts. By the time Texas was laid down, the North Carolinas and the Delawares had commissioned, but that was it. Now, during that experience and the working up of the subsequent class, there were some lessons that were coming out, and one of them was that for the US at least, the turbines that they were able to manufacture were considerably less efficient than the vertical triple expansion engines, in terms of you put X amount of coal in, you get Y amount of steaming out at cruising speeds. Turbines had their advantages obviously at higher speeds, but it was a significant problem for a navy that needed to operate across the Pacific without that many fueling bases. And so the US Navy as it had done in all of its contracts up to this point, included clauses that basically said, you know, we would like to have turbines of X amount of power for Y amount of speed, but we reserve the right to go back to vertical triple expansion engines if ones of similar power output and speed capability but better efficiency can be found. And when it came to the construction of USS Texas, they ended up finding that, at least from their early ships, early dreadnoughts that were coming online, there was this massive gap in efficiency. And so because US manufacturers couldn't therefore evidently produce turbines that were close enough in efficiency to justify having them in the ships, and they didn't want the US Navy to be an experimental fleet because you don't want to gamble and experiment with your primary line of defense, they reverted back to vertical triple expansion engines. They knew, yes, it would compromise the ship's capabilities to run at top speed for prolonged periods of time, although forced lubrication was beginning to solve some of those issues. But they viewed it as better that the ships could actually show up at all in their combat theatres than, you know, not show up but be really nice and high speed efficient. And so that's how you ended up with the situation with USS Texas. So to a certain extent, yes, it was making a point to manufacturers that they couldn't produce the requisite turbines, but it was more just a general acknowledgement of the state of engine technology that could be accessed by the United States at the time. Mike Hall asks, I found amongst some old papers a short death notice from 1953 for my paternal grandfather, who retired from the Navy as a Chief Petty Officer. What's the best way to investigate his naval career and also the ships that he served on? So, since Mike is in the UK, this would be the sequence that I would follow. I have mentioned this sequence a couple of other times, but it is worth reiterating. Firstly, boot up ye olde Google and put in UK MOD military service records. The first result that should come up is a gov.uk link that says get a copy of military service records overview, gov.uk. And then you'll see that in the overview you can apply for your own records if you're part of the UK military. And the next one is apply for the records of someone who's deceased. So follow that link. And then you scroll down past a bunch of stuff which is mostly to do with the army. And then you'll get to a point where it says apply online for Royal Navy, including Royal Marines and RAF records. That bit you can do online, and it says start now. There's a £30 charge, and it says you'll need a digital copy of the death certificate for the person you're requesting the records for. So sounds like you've got that, and a debit or credit card in order to pay the £30 charge. Fill in the relevant details, and they should then be able to get you relevant records. Now, to be fair, applying for records directly from the MOD does have a little bit of a narrow window. Nowadays, because of the most recent sets of record releases, it's mostly good for researching relatives who served in the latter part of the interwar period in World War II, as the World War I and prior records have now become public domain and can be accessed through a variety of places, including somewhere like Ancestry.com. So if you happen to have an Ancestry or similar account, or someone who does, given from the rest of the text that Mike sent, that are sort of serving in the Boxer Rebellion and so forth, you're probably looking at late Victorian, early World War I service. It may be best to start off there because it won't cost you anything to do. And then if that doesn't show anything up or only shows up partial records, then you can go via the MOD, and they might have the tail end of those records. And if you don't know anyone who has an Ancestry.com account, I do. So, ping me an email with as much detail as you can, and I'll see what I can dig up. Jim Smitty asks, what could Imperial Japanese Navy forces have done in late 1945 to oppose the landings called for in Operation Downfall? Could they even sortie what ships they had left in the aftermath of the attacks on Kure in the Inland Sea in July 1945? Or would it have been nothing more than a bunch of midget subs and kamikaze boats attacking the land forces? So the Japanese really didn't have a lot left. This image, which is sometimes relatively famously reproduced, is actually something of an overestimation of what the Japanese had left. At least when it comes to the bigger ships. They certainly didn't have a Yamato still lying around. Now, with that said, a do-or-die thrust by pretty much everything in the Japanese arsenal might have had some effect if they could time it right, except for two rather large problems. One was that the Japanese Navy was scattered all across the Japanese coast, so combining everything would have been a bit of a task, assuming that air power didn't pick them off one by one. And secondly, the Japanese didn't have anywhere near enough fuel even for a short-range do-or-die mission by their combined fleet. So the vast majority of their heavy surface forces were basically going to act as relatively static anti-aircraft and possibly shore defence battery emplacements up until such time as they were sunk in place, which a number of them already actually had been. So yeah, if it had come down to it, then yes, the vast majority of Japanese Navy efforts when it came to opposing Operation Downfall would have been suicide boats, suicide torpedoes, submarine attacks, and what remained of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Air Force units. And that would have been that. I mean, in terms of what the Allies could have brought up against them, the Allies obviously had overwhelming material superiority to the point that the Allied plan included basically forming an entire massive fleet that consisted of so many warships that any reasonable person seeing it approach on radar or by scout would conclude that it was not just the warships, it was the warships and the invasion fleet, and therefore everybody would attack it. But in fact, it would just be a portion of Allied warship strength, specifically the fastest, best anti-aircraft armed portion, and their entire purpose was to act as a giant decoy and soak up as much of the Japanese kamikaze effort, whether that be subsurface, surface or air, as humanly possible. And then when the Japanese had expended the vast majority of said attacks, then the actual invasion, which would be escorted by even more warships, plus the majority of those warships from the decoy effort, would then go in and actually make the landings. Tim Jacobs asks, the June 2022 issue of Warship International magazine has an article by Jose Medina and Bill Jurens on standardized range tables and penetration probabilities for main battery naval guns in World War II. How does their analysis compare/contrast with the analysis you did a few months ago? Are there any glaring differences? Now, to be clear, what's being referred to is the quarterly Warship Journal, Warship International Journal, published by the International Naval Research Organization, not Warship International Fleet Review, which is a different publication. Now, the short answer is I can't actually tell you because I don't have a copy of the magazine to hand. However, that does raise a rather interesting separate issue, which is that I went back and checked through all my emails because I thought to myself, hang on, I should have that. And it turns out, yes, I do. I have a international subscription to them. So in theory, I should have copies of those magazines, but I don't. So I guess I shall have to email them and ask them what's up with that. But in the interim, if anybody else obviously is a member of INRO and knows a bit better how to get in contact with them, then if you could point me in the right direction, that might help in discovering where my various copies have randomly wandered off to. And secondly, in particular, if anybody has a copy, a digital copy or scanned copy of that particular article from June 2022, then could you please send it to me so that I can answer Tim's question? As I said, I do actually have a live subscription, so, it's not something I shouldn't have. It's just for whatever reason the magazines haven't been making their way to me, which is a bit sad. Oh well, hopefully we'll get that sorted out. Saul Ginsler asked, regarding US efforts to sink Yamato on her final voyage, do you know why the US fleet was planning to send the older standard battleships to engage her instead of sending the newer fast battleships? I have no doubt the outcome would be the same either way, but it seems like the fast battleships would have had the easier time of it. Basically, it was a matter of circumstances. As you can see here, Task Force 58 in its various subcomponents, which included all the American fast carriers and all the American fast battleships, was orbiting over to the east by northeast of Okinawa. Task Force 54, Admiral Dao's command, which was the shore bombardment ships, were obviously at Okinawa itself. And then you also had Task Force 57 with King George V and Howe, which were in the vicinity. Now, if Yamato had survived the air attack and headed, as you can see there, on the proposed course towards Okinawa, that meant that Admiral Dao's force would be directly in its path anyway, so it was a relatively minimal redeployment to move them to intercept. Whereas to send the fast battleships from Task Force 58 would first have required to detach them from Task Force 58, which would have meant a substantial reduction in both surface and anti-aircraft firepower for escorting the fast carrier task force, which, as you can see, is not exactly a million miles away from the Japanese home islands. They would then have to proceed west by southwest past Okinawa and then lay in an intercept course for Yamato, which they could in theory do, but if Yamato was cranking it on at full speed and hadn't been stopped, then the US fast battleships, if they'd done the same thing, would have been arriving with relatively narrow margins. Basically, they would have had to know exactly where to head, or there would be the possibility that Yamato might bypass them, whereas Dao's force, just by moving slightly to the northwest of their existing positions, could physically interpose themselves on that particular line of advance and basically prevent the enemy from doing anything. So by having Dao's force move to intercept, it actually made the intercept slightly more guaranteed, and it meant that the carrier task force remained fully protected. DM Phoenix asks, I would like to hear your thoughts on the British World War I era turret-top flying-off platforms for scout planes. The Sopwith takes off from the battleship out at sea, performs its recon tasks, scouting for enemy vessels, depletes its fuel, but then what happens? It doesn't have pontoons to return to the mothership by water landing, there aren't any operational aircraft carriers with flight decks. Where was this plane and its crew supposed to go? Attempt to ditch at sea near the fleet? And furthermore, could this flimsy wooden launch platform hold up to main battery fire so close to the muzzle? So there are two flavours. As you can see here, this is HMS Emperor of India, and she's got an aircraft mounted on Q turret and an aircraft mounted on B turret. Now, as I say, there were two flavours to this, one of which was two-seat scout aircraft, and the other of which was fighters. Now, the fighters were primarily there to give the fleet a form of air defence against mostly Zeppelins, but in theory any kind of air attack, although it was very much a one-shot and done deal, because, as you said, they aren't getting those aircraft back. If the fleet was operating close enough to a friendly shore base, then the aircraft would try and divert there after they'd done their bit. If that wasn't possible, then they would have to find a nearby helpful destroyer and ditch there. If circumstances allowed, the destroyer would then try and haul the aircraft on board. You wouldn't be able to salvage the whole aircraft, but the engines and the guns could be salvaged, even if the rest of the frame had to be cut away. But worst comes to worst, then you just recover the pilot and let the aircraft go and sink. Aircraft at the time obviously are relatively cheap and disposable, especially with how quickly advancing aircraft technology was in the 1910s. So, by and large, it's actually a form of improvised one-off fleet air defence. So if a Zeppelin shows up, 2 or 3 battleships might launch fighters. They're out of fighters, but hey, you've got 3 dozen battleships and battlecruisers in the fleet, and some of the larger cruisers and so forth have this equipped as well. In terms of the scouting aircraft, now that could be used either to facilitate the fleet's long-distance scouting to find the enemy fleet or to find something ashore. Again, the aircraft was seen as disposable when it returned, or it could be used for gunfire spotting and so forth in an actual battle. If that was going to be the case, then the aircraft again would be seen as disposable because they'd basically be up in the air for as long as the engagement was likely to last, and worst comes to worst, another battleship wouldn't be launching them, because at the time of action, any aircraft that could be launched would have been launched, and any aircraft that hadn't been launched up to that point would be shoved over the side because of the fire hazard. So, well, and also, as you mentioned, the fact that the platform may not necessarily hold up to blast effects. The platform on the turret itself probably would be fine, but the little extension runners they stuck on the gun barrels would probably come apart. So yeah, that's the history of the Grand Fleet and its rather improvised air defense-aerial recon capability. Bizarrely enough, if you actually added up the number of aircraft deployed on various ships in the Grand Fleet, they actually had about 120 to 140 aircraft which were theoretically capable of being launched very, very rapidly into the sky to give the fleet a rather substantial air umbrella. It's just that once that was used up, that was it. You weren't getting them back until you went back to shore. Brian Roper asks, what ship design should not have worked but wound up having the best career and or most significant impact on a battle? There's a few different ones, but if you want to compare and contrast potential and actual outcomes, I think the Lexington class probably remains the top for me in this case, because as battle cruisers, the Lexington class flat out should not and almost certainly would not have worked. They, yes, they've got speed, yes, they've got firepower, but they've got armor thicknesses of the type that would are barely better than the first generation battle cruisers, let alone even HMS Queen Mary, which famously explodes, has better belt armor than a Lexington class. And yes, some people will say, oh, they're designed for scouting, they're not supposed to meet the enemy battle line, but come on, if your two biggest prospective opponents are Britain and Japan, well, Japan's building the Amagis and the British are building the G3s and have a bunch of other battle cruisers already. So if you're building a battle cruisers and you're putting them in your fleet screen element, you are going to run into enemy battle cruisers whether you like it or not. At which point the armor on the Lexingtons, even with an inclination, is basically going to act as a rather nice way of ensuring that the fuses are armed when the shells crash home. So yeah, as actual battle cruisers, if they'd ever actually gone to war against peer opponents, the Lexington class probably would have gone down in history as one of the worst ideas in the long, sad history of bad ideas. But instead, they were converted, and okay, Lexington herself didn't have the world's longest war, but Saratoga definitely did, and between the two of them, Lexington and Saratoga had huge impacts, not just on the actual battles of World War II itself, but also on the development of US aircraft carriers' design and doctrine in the interwar period. So they had an absolutely outsized effect, which was a positive for the US Navy in their carrier form, whereas in their battle cruiser form, they probably would just be a salutary lesson on how not to build battle cruisers. Chief Eyeroll asks, during World War II, many battleships are mentioned serving as escorts for convoys in the Atlantic, yet I don't recall accounts of them being attacked by submarines while on this duty. Why was this, and where were the battleships generally positioned relative to the convoy? So there were a few attempted U-boat launches at the battleships in question. However, by and large, you have to factor in really two major issues. Firstly, is that the vast majority of battleship escort missions for the convoys took place in the first few years of the war, which were also the years when the U-boats had the least presence. There were just physically not quite as many U-boats. And secondly, if a battleship was going to be escorting a convoy, i.e. they thought there was a reasonable chance that a German surface raider of fairly large size might show up and have a go at it, the battleship wouldn't be alone in being assigned escort to the convoy, because there would be at least destroyers, possibly a cruiser or two added as well. So a convoy that sailed under battleship protection was also sailing under substantial additional protection above and beyond the average convoy anyway, which made the U-boat's job much, much harder if they happened to run into said convoy. Of course, Once the two Scharnhorsts had completed the Channel Dash, and they were now in Germany, and at least in Scharnhorst's case, subsequently up in Norway, and Bismarck was sunk, there was no longer a capital ship grade threat to convoys, because the only remaining German capital ships were up in Norway, so the Arctic convoys were at risk, but not the mid-ocean Atlantic convoys. And so the number of battleship escorted convoys, once the German capital ship threat was reduced, dropped off quite dramatically. And roughly speaking, the worst periods of the Battle of the Atlantic tend to coincide with just after that period. So I suspect if, say, the Germans had kept a capital ship or two operating on the French west coast or something like that, and therefore the need for battleship escorts had continued, then possibly one or two battleships might have been hit, at the very least, by U-boats, but we'll never know. There's also the fact that the convoys the battleships tended to escort tended to be some of the faster ones, which made them harder to attack for submarines anyway. And as far as where the battleships sailed, at least if we're talking Atlantic convoys as opposed to the Mediterranean ones, the battleships would tend to sail with the merchant ships as part of the main body, because that was the easiest location for them to be and respond to any kind of long-range gunfire fairly quickly from any direction. They certainly didn't need to be out on the peripheries trying to hunt down U-boats. Matt Osborne asks, what is the best source on the radio experiments of Admiral Jackson? Well, his efforts to invent, basically, and then experiment with radio are chronicled in quite a number of different sources, but in parts, which is quite annoying. So for those of you who aren't aware, as a captain, the later Admiral Jackson was a quite prolific radio inventor and fine-tuner, to the point that it's quite often been said that if he wasn't serving under the restrictions on doing research and making money off of it that he had to as a naval officer, it's entirely possible that we might be talking about the Jackson wireless telegraphy sets instead of the Marconi ones. So there's that. But the only book that I've been able to find which specifically seems to deal with what he did as a radio telegraph engineer would be the book Captain Henry Jackson of HMS Defiance, Victorian Ship-to-Ship Communications Pioneer, by John Hooper, which is available in some locations. Now, to be clear, it is a relatively small book, and it's sort of a local history type book, but outside of that, you'd have to be looking into some fairly deep academic titles. I've got one in the library that's all about radio and wireless telegraphy, which actually does mention Jackson scattered about in various points of detail with various ADM reference numbers to look up, which I can provide if you want. You know how to get in contact with me, but to say that's much more of a trawling through a much larger compendium in order to find specific items. Glenn Ricafrente asks, if ABDA Command was an international fleet that didn't quite work, what's your best example of a combined fleet that did? Well, the combined fleet that went to the Battle of Lepanto's probably just about a good example. They were, to be fair, an incredibly fractious lot, and it almost all fell apart before Lepanto, and the Holy League itself didn't last too much longer thereafter. But in terms of getting a very disparate bunch of people who under any other circumstances would absolutely not have gotten on at all, and pointing them all in the same direction and getting them to win a major naval battle, under that very narrow paradigm, the fleet that fought at Lepanto was probably a fairly successful combined one. And actually, post-ABDA Command, combined Allied command of various fleets in World War II went a lot better. I mean, there were certain lessons to be learned from the debacle that was ABDA Command, but and also the circumstances that it was under were a significant factor, being pushed together at the very, very last minute and placed with some fairly difficult situations. But if you look at naval operations thereafter, in especially the Mediterranean, but also in and around the Atlantic and the North Sea, you have operations where you have British, American, Dutch, Free French, Free Norwegian, Free Polish, Free Greek, etc. forces, especially in the Med, all operating together and actually working pretty well. So in the overall arc, even of World War II, ABDA Command is more the anomaly than the rule when it comes to joint Allied fleet operations. I think the single biggest factor, if you, apart from the exact circumstances, if you want to try and pull apart what the difference is between all those other operations and ABDA Command, and a few other related issues in the early part of the Pacific War, is that the fleets that expected to be in charge generally were in the other cases, and also therefore there were officers who were used to leading large fleets where perhaps certain ships had never really operated alongside others. Whilst the admiral in charge of ABDA Command, at least in its active fighting stages, Admiral Dorman, whilst he was a fairly good officer, he'd never led a fleet that size. He'd never expected to have to lead a fleet that size, and therefore, he was in a somewhat worse position, except by matter of pure seniority, to deal with all the circumstances that came with leading a relatively large contingent of ships. Whereas for the average American or British admiral, the idea of leading several dozen warships in any given circumstance was not exactly foreign to them. Camino John asks, can you think of any examples of countries during the Ironclad Age era, pre or post World War I, where design choices for their ships were directly impacted by the abundance or lack of natural resources for them to utilise? Not particularly, mainly for the reason that there were too much larger throttles on what you were going to design and build in for your warships. The single biggest one being money. What could you afford? You could have a country that was incredibly rich in the resources that were needed to develop whatever counted for modern warships, whether that be ironclads, early steel ships, or full-on dreadnoughts. But if you didn't have the funds to pay for it all, well, then you weren't going anywhere. Secondly, there is the other factor of industry. Now, again, you might have all the money in the world, you might have all the resources in the world, but if you don't have the shipyard industry capable of supporting and building these warships, you're still pretty stuck. However, if you don't have the shipyards, etc., then you can get around this, as long as you have the money, by simply buying overseas. So even if you had absolutely none of the right kinds of resources, doesn't matter, just buy from somebody else and they have the resources. And this is pretty much the case throughout the period you're looking at, bearing in mind that it's only after World War I that export restrictions start to come in for some kinds of ships. But then, to be honest, in the 1920s, not that many people have any money to afford them in the first place. But, all the way right back as far as the early ironclads, when you get things like Huascar and some of the ironclads that ended up fighting, some of those South American countries at the time didn't, although they might technically have had the resources in the ground, they didn't have the extraction industry set up to extract those resources. They didn't have the industry to build the vessel in the first place, even if they had the resources. But what they did have was the money, so they could just buy things from overseas and solve the issues that way. Manani Wanderer asks, why are the senior officers of a command referred to as the brass? There's quite a variety of theories that are percolated around in regards to this, but the most convincing one that I've heard of, as far at least as naval issue stuff is concerned, is that when it comes to the displaying of your rank, then lower ranks tend, at least when they even had some kind of insignia, tended to have sewn on or various stitched or cloth patches indicating their rank, whereas the senior staff, the brass, would have various buttons or pins, brooches, etc. that signify their rank depending on what navy you were in. These would be coloured, usually silver or gold. They might even be silver or gold for formal dress wear, but more commonly they would be made of coloured brass, and all of this gold brocade that you can see would usually have some kind of brass wire underlay or brass wire stitched into it to give it stiffness and durability. Hence, any senior officer would be wearing a reasonable amount of brass on them, and they would then be referred to as the brass, or the brass officer, or the brass hat, etc., etc. Andre Gardner asks, do Royal Navy vessels stock demonstrably more tea than those of other navies? Demonstrably more than most other navies? Yes, absolutely, certainly, and in a wide variety of different types, because of course you can never guarantee what exact kind of tea different officers and men aboard might like. In terms of more tea than any other navy, well, funny as it might seem, probably not, because on a British ship you'll have some people who drink tea, you'll have some people who drink coffee, some people who drink both, and some people who drink neither. And whilst you will have a variety aboard pretty much any ship in any navy, one rather suspects that certain navies, like for example the Indian Navy, probably have a considerably higher percentage of tea drinkers and therefore large amounts of tea aboard than even a British vessel. Sebastian asks, on October 25th, 1944, the Japanese aircraft carrier Chiyoda was sunk by aircraft and gunfire from cruisers and destroyers. I've read several accounts, and all of them say that no survivors were permitted to be rescued, presumably by US Rear Admiral Lawrence Dubose. As a result, Captain Joe Echiro and his entire crew of 1,470 officers and men went down with the ship. Why was no rescue permitted? Accounts I've read clearly state many Japanese sailors were clinging to the hull of the ship and were clearly visible by US crews. Was this simply the result of the brutality of the war in the Pacific, or is there another strategic or tactical reason? So the only military rationale that I can arrive at, looking at the battle in context and the circumstances of Chiyoda's sinking, is that potentially, given that the cruiser-destroyer force that actually eventually sank her would proceed on to engage other elements of the Japanese forces, or at least try to, in the subsequent few hours, it may be that the Admiral in question believed that as his ships were still in an ongoing combat operation and could be attacked at any time, bearing in mind that Admiral Halsey believed that Ozawa's force was in fact fully operational, they didn't realise it was a decoy, he may have forbidden the picking up of survivors on the basis that it would leave his ships vulnerable and stationary in an active combat zone when he was having to proceed north with the rest of his ships, which therefore might leave him and all the ships he left behind in danger. But that is speculation on my part based on what the ships in this particular force actually went on to do in the rest of the battle. Outside of that, then yeah, it would pretty much just come down to spite. Blacksmith Panzer asks, what are your thoughts on Admiral Yamamoto? He has clearly undergone what I'd call a degree of Romulization here in the West, but I still have the feeling that he was a fairly decent flag officer, and how do you think the war would have progressed had he not been killed when he was? I'd say I'd broadly agree with you. Yamamoto was not a stupid man. He was actually pretty smart, pretty on the ball, a fairly good tactician, and one of the few people who was able to keep the Japanese Navy from tearing itself apart internally or launching a war of aggression against its latest and greatest rival, the Imperial Japanese Army. So, you know, he certainly had a fair degree of organisational and diplomatic skills as well. He was, if he had any major fault, obviously given to something of a penchant for overly complicated plans, which didn't tend to help all that much. However, outside of that, you know, when you compare him to other good flag officers of varying nations, Yamamoto doesn't fall too far behind most of them, except for the fact that he's the one who's fighting with the short end of the stick, i.e. he's got the limited resources, he knows he's got the limited resources, and he knows that the Japanese government is putting him into a war that he actually can't win, but he's trying to do the best that he can. Now, that's not to say that he made the right call all the time, and he did have to be talked out of a few rather interesting decisions by his subordinates, but, broadly speaking, he's certainly in the upper third of naval officers. As far as how would the war have progressed if he'd not been killed, to be honest, by the time Yamamoto was killed, that wasn't so much about diminishing the Japanese capacity for strategic thought. That was more about just wanting to get rid of Yamamoto because of the role he'd played in planning the Pearl Harbor attacks. By that point, the Japanese were being overwhelmed by the industrial output of the United States, and there was precious little anyone could do about it. Admiral Ozawa, for example, and a few others were equally good leaders, also very good tacticians, and in Yamamoto's absence, they put together, in most cases, the best defense that they could, but, there's a limited amount to what you can do. It's kind of like the scenario I've pointed out a few times when it came to the fact that towards the end of the war, the Japanese could read American IFF and work out where all their planes were. Yeah, the fact that you know where a 500-strong American airstrike is long before the Americans know where you are or what your status is great and fantastic. What exactly are you going to do with this information, though? And it turns out you can't actually do all that much, so therefore is it actually any use? And similarly with Japanese flag officers, by the time you get to the latter part of World War II, there is not a lot that the Japanese can do, regardless of how skilled their flag officers are, simply just because of the overwhelming state of the firepower that they face. The Outer Circle asks, the English defeats in the Battle of the Channel, such as Beachy Head, led to changes in warship design, resulting in the 2-deck 80-gunner, but vessels like the Sussex were unstable, and even rebuilding the ships as 3-deckers failed. They also arguably failed in their 50-gun designs. What went so wrong at a time when the English were starting to standardise their building and design of ships? There's a wide mixture of factors at play. A number of other nations around this time also had a variety of failures when it came to ship design. The English problem was twofold. One was that at this point, this is kind of the very end of the 1600s, start of the 1700s, they're beginning to realise that they actually need a full-on professional navy with very large numbers of ships on a constant basis, whereas before this, they'd come to this realisation occasionally and then it had gone away and then it'd come back again and gone away again. Whereas now you start to see this kind of the main drive of having a fairly large Royal Navy consistently. And in order to do that, you need a large number of ships, but as is so often the case, people try to go, yeah, but what if we could get that large number of ships we need for less money? And so you end up with things like the 50 gunners. Now, the 50 gunners weren't too bad in and of themselves at the time that they were built. The problem was that being relatively small capital ships, they were very rapidly overtaken by events, both because they had relatively small number of guns and they weren't big enough to expand that number of guns, but also the guns themselves were relatively light. So the main battery gun deck of a very beginning of the 1700s 50 gunner was the 18-pounder gun, whereas even the 60 gunners, which weren't that much bigger, had a baseline 24-pounder gun deck. So it made the 50 gunners nice and cheap, but also substantially less effective than even ships only slightly larger than themselves. And that's why they relatively quickly fall out of use as compared to 60 gunners, 64 gunners, which stay around as ships of the line in some way, shape or form. Even though they are being phased out by the end of the century, they are still around to a degree. And then at the upper end of things, when you have things like the 2-decker 80 gunners, this is more a case of the British trying to cram a lot of firepower into a relatively small vessel. Again, the British like the smaller hulls because they're more agile, they tend to be more seaworthy, but being smaller hulls, they are also much easier to overload if you push your luck. And taking what is in effect a very, very early form of the standardized third-rate ship of the line, and sticking 80 guns into a relatively small hull tends to lead to ships being quite unstable. The French and Spanish 80 gunners that you'd see later on in the century, you see in large part because their hulls are considerably longer and larger, so that they can actually carry the weight of metal they're supposed to. Because the other problem is that, unlike the 50 gunners, at 80 guns these ships are supposed to carry quite heavy guns, as well as quite a number of them. And yeah, once you've got a relatively poor ship design, rebuilding it within reasonable limits isn't going to help you all that much. Reichspear Minister asks, what were the lessons learned on aircraft carrier crews of the US Navy until the end of World War II? Well, to be honest, pretty much that is part and parcel of what US aircraft carriers as a whole learned during World War II. You've got, obviously, lessons about damage control, very definitely learned, but also lessons about how to spot aircraft to launch strikes as quickly as possible, because to be perfectly honest, the US ability to launch mass airstrikes at the very beginning of the war using its aircraft carriers really wasn't there. If you look through the first few battles and the amount of time it took them to get any substantial amount of aircraft off, it was pretty bad, even as late as parts of Guadalcanal when they'd learned. But part of that was how you arrange the aircraft on the flight deck. Another part of it was how do you fuel, arm and warm up the aircraft. Certain sequences that worked perfectly well in peacetime, when you had all the time in the world to prepare, didn't work so well in wartime, when you had to get aircraft up there as quickly as humanly possible and you couldn't afford to be running around left, right and centre. And so the aircraft carrier crews learned all of that. They obviously learned also a fairly big salutary lesson in how important air defence was. So many more of the carrier's crew by the end of the war were in air defence positions manning various anti-aircraft guns, as opposed to what they had been before. And also towards the end of the war, a rather interesting lesson which actually hasn't been superseded even as carriers have gotten much, much, much larger, which is that operating a flight group of over 100 aircraft is actually near enough moving towards being physically impossible. Yes, in theory you can actually launch more than 100 aircraft, but managing it all, anything from just the organizational logistics to getting them all in line to just the amount of time it takes to physically launch that many aircraft, it appears to be something of a hard upper limit on carrier flight operations, unless and until somebody either invents a carrier that can launch 6 aircraft at a time and has the flight deck commensurate to handle all of that. So yeah, there were a lot of different lessons learned by US aircraft carrier crews that cover pretty much everything about what it means to be a carrier. Duke Master asks, I've rewatched your Barbary Pirates video a few times and always wondered about the European attitude toward them. They seemed perfectly content to let themselves be extorted and taken advantage of for the longest time. But it was only when the US took action of its own that everyone seemed to think, we should have thought about that first. Why were so many countries so patient with the Barbary states for so long? There was a wide variety of reasons. At first, the Barbary states were at least notionally under the protection of the Ottoman Empire, back when the Ottoman Empire was something that no European country wanted to mess with. And once that gradually went away, not because the Ottoman Empire itself went away, but because the relative power of the European states versus the Ottomans grew quite considerably, there was a couple of additional problems. One was that as long as the Barbary states weren't attacking you, they were quite useful to have around, especially if you could persuade them to attack somebody that you didn't like. And so having them around as kind of a third-party group that you could bribe, beg, borrow, steal in order to get to cause endless problems for your enemies, which of course you would be entirely blameless for, that was fairly attractive to a lot of European powers. So they might slap them down, and regular Barbary slapping expeditions did take place, but they were never slapped quite hard enough to make them go away entirely, because you never know, they might be useful a few years down the line. The other problem was that actually the Barbary pirates were incredibly difficult to dig out, and this relates to the amount of force that you'd need to go in and get rid of them. they were remarkably resilient as well. So you could go in, as Algiers was a few times, you could go in, shoot up Algiers, burn it to the ground, free everybody who was there at the time who needed freeing, go back home, and you think, great, Algiers is dealt with. And 5 years down the line, it's back up and running again, because when you come in from the sea, everyone just, well, they'll be fighting, but a lot of people will just run out into the wilderness. No one can be bothered to go after them, so then they just come back and start over again. And, you know, a bunch of the pirates would have been out at sea as well anyway, so they wouldn't have been there at the time. So they're incredibly difficult to actually permanently destroy. And that's related to the fact that the Barbary states, plural, are multiple different political entities. So if you knock out one of them, the others will just be like, oh, great, more opportunity for us. So even if you suppress one, that's not actually necessarily going to solve your problems at all, other than maybe make the other states angry and therefore make things worse. If you were going to take out the Barbary pirates, you'd have to organise an expedition that was strong enough and capable enough of either descending on every single Barbary port at once, or going from port to port, completely pulverising each with minimal losses, so that you could work your way up and down those coastlines. And that would require a huge commitment in money and a huge commitment in strength during a period when Europe was engaged in usually some form of 15-way standoff with each other. So anyone who depleted their naval strength and troop strength, for that matter, significantly enough to go and deal on their own, off their own back and out of their own pocket with the Barbary pirates, would be opening themselves up as vulnerable to everybody else who might want to take advantage of that. Because why not take advantage of it? Because then you get primacy of position over whoever it is you've just stabbed in the back. And in theory, they've also dealt with the Barbary pirate problem for you as well. And since everybody knew that was what was going to happen, nobody wanted to be the one who put a step out first. As I said, there were occasional Barbary punitive raids, which would be conducted by various powers in an attempt to wrangle them in line, but because of all these various restrictions, it was usually more of a case of hitting them hard enough to make them go, okay, we won't attack you specifically for the next little while, but can we please go and attack someone else, at which point you'd supply them the names, addresses, and ship names and listings of all the people you didn't like, and then they'd go off happy as a clam. Matt Blom asks, how were battleship barrel liners fitted into the barrel itself? Based on the photos I've seen, the tolerances of the fit seem incredibly tight, and given the size and metal-on-metal friction, I'm curious how they made this happen. It depends on exactly which battleship gun you're looking at, because different guns work in slightly different ways when it comes to their barrel liners. Some, and this is covering the whole range of guns, everything from particularly heavy cruiser guns all the way up to Yamato's 18.1 inch, some were actually had their liners locked in place, and so you could unbolt the liners and then you could take a hydraulic ram or something similar and literally just pop them out and then put a new one in. Yes, it's a very tight fit, but that's what grease and hydraulic pistons are for. You then also at the other end of things have liners that basically can't come out, so they're put in as part of the final stages of construction of the gun, but once they wear out, the only way to deal with them is to actually bore them out. So you'd basically put the barrel on a giant lathe, and you'd have to completely bore out the old liner and insert a brand new one. But for most battleship guns that had so-called removable liners, effectively what you would be doing is putting the gun barrel through the final stage of manufacture again. So in this kind of gun, what you would do is the outer part of the gun would be heated, so it expands, so there's slightly more room, and then either it would be put over the liner or the liner would be put in it, and then the gun would be allowed to cool, and that would shrink the gun tight onto the liner. If you wanted to replace that liner, then, as I said, you'd do that in reverse. So you'd heat the gun up, the gun would expand, the liner would become loose, you could then extract that. Usually the furnaces that did this had the gun hanging vertically. Out came the liner, then you'd get a new liner, you'd put the new liner in and let the gun cool down again, and presto, you have a newly relined gun. Of course, the fact you put through that gun through so much thermal stress would mean you'd have to reproof the gun, so you'd have to shoot it again, make sure that everything's still working. But this is why you have spare stocks of guns as well as liners. So if a ship comes in and it needs a bunch of guns replaced, you can just swap out the old guns with brand new lined guns, and then the old guns can be taken and relined at the pace suitable for the procedure. John McCarthy asks, many accounts of battle damage say something like the hit let in X thousand tons of water. How does one interpret figures like this? If the answer involves comparing the flooding with reserve buoyancy, what are some typical values for battleships, carriers and other major ship types, and where would one find such information? It can be difficult to interpret exactly how bad it is, other than, assuming we're talking about capital ships, letting several thousand tons of water in is not a good idea. And that's because that flooding can be distributed in different areas, and those areas can have different effects. To say nothing of, obviously, if you flood your machinery spaces, you lose power. That's a separate matter entirely. But if all your flooding is concentrated at the bow, for instance, you go bow down into the water, that can actually kill your ship a heck of a lot quicker than the amount of water that's been taken in might otherwise suggest. Because your reserve buoyancy, i.e. how much water you can take on before you lose buoyancy and the ship sinks, does not necessarily have to be mitigated entirely before you start to sink. So, as I said, if you have a ship that goes bow down because most of the flooding is in the bow, that might raise the stern to the point that the propellers come out of the water, or the rudder comes out of the water, or both, at which point you have no steering or propulsion, even though technically both systems are still running, at which point you're stuck and you're going to eventually flood and sink anyway. You could have all the flooding take place on one side, in which case you might roll over and sink, even though you haven't actually exceeded your total reserve buoyancy, because the water being all on one side means your centre of gravity is shifted, your metacentric height is shifted, you go over on your side, that induces more flooding and down you go, even though that initial bit of flooding itself technically wasn't enough to make you negatively buoyant. If the flooding is concentrated in any given area, that can be worse than more generalised flooding, but more generalised flooding has more chance of compromising multiple different systems. And so, looking back at sadelets, which we covered recently, for example, a way of making sadelets draw less water was actually to flood her more, because her overall reserve buoyancy hadn't quite been compromised. And by inducing more flooding aft, she's had a more even keel. So if the ship is on average riding, let's say, 15 foot lower than she should be, then that's one thing. But if all the flooding is in Sadelets' case in the bow, even though it's less flooding, the disproportionate nature of it might mean the bow is actually down 30 foot without any flooding in the stern. And then, of course, you have the issue of where is your reserve buoyancy? Not just in terms of physical location on the ship, because that'll affect the trim of the vessel, but also what part is protected. And this is one of the weaknesses of Bismarck's design, for instance. Most ships in World War II, at least most battleships, followed the same kind of principle that Warrior followed back at the very beginning of armoured vessels, where the idea was that as long as the citadel remained unbreached, which in Warrior's case was the armoured area, in World War II ships that consists of the main armour deck and the armour belt and the box that's formed by the bulkheads at either end of that, as long as that remains unbreached, theoretically all other parts of the ship can flood, but the ship will stay afloat. On Bismarck, that's not the case. Because the armour deck is so much lower, it means that actually you could flood everywhere outside of Bismarck Citadel. You don't have to flood the citadel itself, but by flooding the bow and the stern, you would drag the ship down enough that the flooding could then overtop the armoured deck, and then enough of the ship is flooded that you get negative buoyancy and the ship sinks. So when it comes to the ship has taken on X thousand tons of water, As a rough guide to how much trouble you're in, you just look at the overall number compared to the overall displacement of the ship. But exactly how much trouble you're in depends very much on exactly where that flooding is. And in terms of how they work out how much water has come on board, it's basically a case of the volumes of each compartment within the ship are known, and if each compartment is flooded, if you assume that it's fully flooded, then you can add up the number of compartments, add up their respective volumes, and you come up with a total amount of water that's in the ship. Christopher Dent asks, which class or type of vessel from the World War I, World War II period had the most success in a role other than that which it was originally intended for? For example, the Clemson class being repurposed into high-speed transports. I mean, it'd be very easy to say the carrier conversions, because obviously, Furious and Saratoga, at least the ones that survived, had a very extensive role with a great deal of success, and that was nothing like the ships that they originally were, but it is a little bit of an easy target, to be perfectly honest. The Clemsons, as you mentioned, had quite a lot of success in roles from convoy escorts to transports and so forth, but also actually something like, say, the Atlanta class, because remember, originally the Atlanta class were designed as small cruisers for destroyer flotilla leading, something that turned out actually was a terrible idea to put them in, but they're now known and ubiquitously as anti-aircraft cruisers because that's what they came up with as a role for them, and something that they did exceptionally well in. You could also look at the Abdeel class mine layers, which functioned as troop transports, fast cargo transport, scout ships, etc., etc. They had all sorts of roles based primarily on the fact they could just go really, really, really fast, and actually did remarkably little mine laying. Sina asks, in World War II and the modern day, capital ships have battle groups around them. Was there anything like this in the Age of Sail, with first rates paired with lesser ships, or was it just ships of the line all getting in a line and blasting away? The idea of battle groups as we understand them today basically comes from the need to escort ships against significant threats like missiles these days, torpedoes in the first half of the 20th century. Before that, significantly before that, basically before the invention of the torpedo, there was no need to escort at them because anything they came across 1v1 they could deal with. Now, obviously, you might have multiple other capital ships show up, which could be a problem for a single capital ship travelling on its own, but it was somewhat rare that that would happen. So everyone would go around with their fleets, but for ships travelling to and from, generally that would just be, the ship in question that was attached, whether that be a first, second or third rate. They'd just sail around on their own. Now, if you wanted to fulfill a specific objective, you might have a screen of frigates for scouting purposes, but that was largely because, a first or second or third rate couldn't be in multiple places at once, and you might have some message boats, packet boats there to relay stuff back and forth, again, because you don't want to use your big capital ship just to run letters to and from the nearest port. But those things weren't really battle groups. You would, as I said, you occasionally might have a scouting screen, but by and large, once you had a few capital ships nicely grouped together, that was all the fleet that you needed, outside of one or two scout frigates. So yeah, nothing like a battle group as we would envisage it today. Mark Griffiths asks, it's come up in a few videos that for the dreadnought battle lines, ships tend to engage their opposite number in lines so that no ship is left unengaged, which would allow the opposition to make more accurate shooting without the distraction of taking hits. However, I understand that one of the key principles of war is concentration of force. Surely there would be benefit in large portions of the fleet targeting a single vessel so that it's very quickly reduced in fighting capability before all moving on to the next target. The only significant disadvantage I can think of would be the ability to separate shots to enable the ships to establish range. Also, as an addendum, slightly cheeky question, my young daughter's got into some of the Horrible History songs. What's your take on their Georgian Navy song and the accuracy about how it portrays the Royal Navy? Well, first off, Horrible Histories is absolutely great, and not just in terms of being good entertainment, but also actually hilariously spot on with the historical accuracy. You'll find that your average Horrible History show has far fewer errors in it than most typical history documentaries, actually. So yeah, if you want a quick précis on any specific history, I'd actually recommend watching the horrible histories, especially the songs. I quite like literally. But anyway, going back to ships in the battle line. Technically, yes, concentrating on one, then moving on to the other would be a good idea. However, it runs into a couple of issues. One, as you mentioned, is separating the shots, and that is a huge issue. It's basically the reason the German battle cruisers survived the death ride of the battle cruisers. It's not that there weren't enough ships firing enough shells at them, and it wasn't that the shells weren't landing in roughly the right place. It was that actually too many ships were firing too many shells at them, to the point that none of the ships could really correct their gunnery ranging all that much, because they didn't really know which splashes were theirs. The irony being that if the Royal Navy had fired on the German battle cruisers with fewer ships, they might actually have scored significantly more damage. So, well, there's one example for you. Now, that really, to be honest, is the single biggest stumbling block for concentration of fire. The other one is that actually the number of times you hit versus the number of shells you fire is still actually fairly low, and as long as you don't get magazine detonations, ships can actually take quite the beating. So even if you had some kind of system, which one of the reasons why dyed shells were brought in, whereby you could have 3, 4, 5 ships all concentrating on one, in the time it would take each of those ships to find the range and start getting hits, it would work over that ship relatively quickly, but to actually put it out of action or sink it might take actually quite a while. And during that time, all the other ships in that battle line are getting some basically peacetime level fire practice against your ships, which means that whilst you might completely and utterly thoroughly destroy the first ship you're targeting, by the time you finish that one off, or maybe if you're really lucky gone after a second one, you're probably going to have a good chunk of your battle line having been damaged or battle suppressed in some way, shape or form. And once all these other ships that are undergoing basically, as I said, peacetime firing conditions have locked in the range and started rapid firing, you'll end up actually losing a lot of your ships very, very quickly. Not necessarily sunk, but certainly knocked out of action, which allows them to move on to others. And once they're all knocked out of action, then they can worry about finishing them off. This is basically the single biggest problem when you simulate concentration of fire, is that virtually no simulation takes into account that it makes it exponentially harder to work out what ship is hitting or missing at what range. The Freaka 86 asks, has there been any mutual job shadowing similar to a student exchange between the navies in the interwar years, like between the Royal Navy and the German Navy, or the Marine Nationale and the German Navy, or the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale? And if so, between which navies, and what skills and information were shared? Wouldn't necessarily call it student exchange, but there certainly was a huge degree of what were called either naval attaches or naval observers, more often than not, as well as officer exchange programs going on in the interwar period between a number of different navies. The most common being between the Royal Navy and various Commonwealth navies, but also the Royal Navy and the US Navy, and a little bit less so between the Royal Navy and the Marine Nationale. The Germans and the Italians sent officers to each other's navies as well. So yeah, it wasn't a kind of, well, you give us 100 of your best officers and we'll give you 100 of ours. It was on a much more ad hoc basis, but you might have, a gunnery expert from one navy go and observe aboard one set of ships from the Allied Navy, and the Allied Navy, they may not send a gunnery expert in exchange. They may send somebody who's specialist in something else. So if they want to learn about, say, carrier operations, they might send one of their carrier flight ops crew officers to go and have a look aboard the Allied carriers, for example. And then they would bring back skills and information based on what they'd learned while they were serving alongside that navy. And this actually continued even during wartime. Obviously, at the Battle of Tsushima, there were numerous naval observers on both sides in the fleets, but in World War II, for example, there were quite a number of US officers who were serving with the British fleet before America was even officially involved in the war. So you had US officers, a US officer writing off into the US Navy about the attack on Taranto, for example, because he'd been there, not actually in the attack itself, but he'd been on the carrier. Fletcher, Fletcher's, fetching, Fletcher, fletching, Fetcher, fetching, Fletcher's, Fletcher, Fletchlings, which I think is Fisher under a new name, asks, how much did the pre-dreadnoughts allowed Germany in the Versailles Treaty affect future Reichsmarine and Kriegsmarine ships? Did any design features or flaws from them sneak into later designs? Broadly speaking, they didn't really have any effect. The Germans knew that they were outdated designs. They had they had the design of every single dreadnought they'd done since the Deutschlands for reference as to what they could do instead. About the only holdover you got from them, were two things. One was that their displacement, to a certain degree, dictated some of the effects of the displacement choices in the Versailles Treaty. Obviously, the Deutschlands did displace more than 10,000 tons, and 10,000 tons was the upper limit. But if the Deutschlands had displaced substantially less or substantially more, then I suspect the limit imposed on German capital ship replacement would have similarly followed. But that's more of a hypothetical. The one thing they definitely did influence was the choice of main gun for their successors. And so, therefore, the Deutschland-class Panzerschiff ended up with 11-inch guns, as the Deutschlands had 11-inch guns, and then the Scharnhorst, although they had very, very different 11-inch guns, still maintained the 11-inch gun. If, for sake of argument, the Germans had been allowed to keep the Helgolands, i.e. 12-inch guns, then I deeply, deeply suspect then the Deutschlands and the Scharnhorsts post-war would have had 12-inch guns. But they didn't, so that's probably the single greatest legacy of the German pre-dreadnoughts. Everything else, they knew was pretty much obsolete design. Kra F1 asks, I read in Ship of Ghosts about Captain Rooks of USS Houston spotting falling bombs and commanding the ship to maneuver or dodge them. Since it was possible to spot free-falling bombs, did anti-aircraft gunners attempt or succeed at shooting them out of the sky? Generally speaking, no. On two bases. One is that, a dive bomber is a lot bigger than the bomb it releases, and dive bombers could make it down through a ship's anti-aircraft fire and pull away relatively scot-free. Didn't work all the time, but enough of them did to give you some idea of just how difficult it would be to actually hit a free-falling bomb. And when there's a big bomb coming towards you and you're in an exposed anti-aircraft position, you're probably more concerned, assuming that there aren't more aircraft around to shoot at, with lying flat and finding a decent solid bit of cover to hide behind. Plus, the ship's violently lurching everywhere, so you need something to hold on to apart from anything else. The other thing is that actually it's very difficult to judge exactly where the bombs are. You can see they're above you, but unlike an aircraft, which has quite a lot of different aspects to it, where you can tell roughly what angle it's at, what speed it's at, how close it is, etc., etc. Bombs, apparently, by all accounts from the people who were involved in World War II, they tend to just seem to hang there as little dots for a very, very long time, and then all of a sudden they grow massively bigger, and then there's an explosion. So it would also be very difficult to actually work out how much lead you're supposed to give the thing in the first place. Plus, depending on the kind of bomb, a general purpose bomb, sure, maybe a 40mm shell or something might be able to do something to it, but if we're talking about, a 2,200 pound armor-piercing dive bomb, launched bomb, then, probably not going to actually do all that much to it. Plus, it also depends on what kind of bomb is being dropped on you, because if it's level bomb from 20,000 feet, then yeah, you've got plenty of time. If it's a dive bomber that's releasing from 1,000 feet or so, much, 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 much less time. Now, with all that said, occasionally people would take the odd spray in the air just to see, because, might as well. And very, very occasionally a bomb might be hit, detonated, knocked off course, etc. But it's the kind of thing of, drop enough bombs and people fire enough bullets, and eventually the two will interact. Even if it's not intentional, it could be that you're still firing away merrily at some bomber somewhere in the attack stream, and you just happen to contact one of the bombs. So yes, it did happen occasionally, but much in the same way as one or two people actually managed to shoot torpedoes out of the water with rifles, it's not something you're ever going to rely on as a means of defence. Connor Johnson asks, there's a somewhat well-known photo that some say is showing HMS Hood outrunning HMS Nelson and HMS Rodney whilst travelling in reverse. Previously you've said this is unfortunately not the case because Hood's wake proves she's actually heading forwards. The question is, could Hood have outrun Nelson and Rodney in reverse if indeed this is what she was trying? It would be very unlikely. The general rule of thumb for most ships is that they can do about 1/4 to 1/3 their top speed forward if they go in reverse, which for Hood would suggest that she could max out at maybe just a fraction over 10 knots in reverse. Now, for Hood herself, I would suspect she might be able to go a little bit quicker, because although the ship's, any ship's hydrodynamic profile, unless it's a double-ender, from aft is not going to be anywhere near as favourable as going forward, and therefore there's going to be a lot more resistance. Hood was obviously a ship with very fine lines, so she probably has somewhat less resistance going aft, so that might push her reverse speed up a knot or 2 or 3. But the other thing you've got to factor in is that forward speed relies on using her entire high pressure turbine set and, basically all power forward. The reverse speed, the reverse gearing, is not in any way, shape or form set up to handle the same amount of power or produce the same amount of power as the ship when she's going forwards. So even if Hood was a remarkably fast sailor in reverse, she's not going to break 23 plus knots, which is what she'd need to beat Nelson and Rodney in a reverse race, at least as far as I can tell from the documentation available. Hi Bacon Bomb asks, what is the point of wing turrets? Was it to maximise forward firepower? Was it to make the ship shorter while trying to maximise broadside? Or something else? Also, were there any ships with all rear-facing turrets and superstructure forward? Well, one of the Matsushima class cruisers had its only main turret aft and just a superstructure with light guns forward, so they did exist, but they were very, very rare. Now, as far as the wing turrets are concerned, at least if we're talking about dreadnoughts, there's a variety of reasons. Yes, for some, particularly Admiral Fisher, maximising forward firepower was a motivation, but for the majority of cases where you find wing turrets, it's actually to do with machinery space allocation. Because, especially in the early dreadnoughts, it wasn't possible to get a decent number of turrets on the centre line and have all the machinery, which also generally tends to gravitate towards the centre line, in the length of ship that was required for the design standards. Now, there were two solutions to this. One was you could just not have as many turrets, in which case you'd have less firepower, or you could make the ship considerably larger, but this is kind of a chasing your own tail situation very early on, because if you made the ship larger, then to move at a given speed you'd need more engine power, which would take up more volume, which would then mean you'd need even more hull space, and so on and so forth. Now, eventually you would reach a balance point, because the square cube law would mean you could fit an insane amount of power inside a given volume and still have a lot of surface deck area. But that would mean for an insanely large ship. The other alternative was to stick wing turrets on. Now, yes, everyone understood it was an inefficient way of doing so. That's why on some of ships like the early German battle cruisers and Colossus and Hercules in the British fleet, for example, they went with offset echelon cross-firing. You got the same thing on the Invincibles and Indefatigables as well, which was an attempt to be able to use all of the guns on the broadside, even if at very limited angles. But generally speaking, it was appreciated that a single turret on the centerline was a much, much better bet than a pair of turrets with one on each wing, even if, in theory, you might be able to get an echelon fire across the ship. But for various reasons, whether it's because you're using vertical triple expansion engines or restrictions in overall size of the ship, etc., they just couldn't fit them on the centerline, and so you end up with the various setups that you do historically. Interestingly enough, Dreadnought and her successors, the Bellerophons and St. Vincents, are probably one of the few instances where the design was deliberately chosen in order to facilitate maximum end on fire, because a number of the different designs drawn up for Dreadnought as the last round did actually have all centerline armament. So that's kind of an exception that proves the rule of choosing it for other reasons, namely the all-forward firepower. But most of the time it was just to do with the fact there wasn't enough space on the amidship centerline to fit all the necessary machinery and all the necessary firepower. Sapper Ninja asks, if the King George V's had been built as Lions instead, do you think they would have had any difference in how major events played out? Denmark Strait, Bismarck sinking, Force Z, North Cape, etc., etc. And might there have been other actions which might have played out differently? Would the overall conflict have been any different? Broadly speaking, I don't think it would have played out too differently. There are, of course, small things that you could look at that might change, but equally those things might change for other reasons. For example, the Lions, obviously 9 16-inch guns, instead of the King George V 10 14-inch guns, you're taking one gun away. So for any given full broadside at least, there is a very slight possibility that any hit that a historic King George V might have scored might be the 1 in 10 that now doesn't hit because that 10th shot doesn't exist. It's a small thing and very marginal and probably not going to make a huge difference or any difference at all, but it might. But in terms of the three engagements you looked at, Denmark Strait, possibly the hit that went underwater and ended up flooding one of Bismarck's boiler rooms might go a bit further, might hit a little bit harder, might cause a little bit more damage, might slow Bismarck down just a bit more. It's a possibility. The hit that goes out in the bow, near as much as makes a difference, is going to be the same. At Bismarck sinking, probably not going to make much difference at all because Bismarck's going down either way. And most of the hits were on the upper works where the 14-inch shells were perfectly adequate for the job. There's one 14-inch hit as far as we know on the main belt armour, and again that seems to have done its job perfectly fine. Force Z, relatively unlikely to make much difference at all. The Lions, at least a Lion that could have been built in time to be in service in 1941, is going to have broadly the same anti-aircraft suite as Prince of Wales, broadly going to perform the same. A lot of what may or may not happen is going to be down just to how the ship is handled. North Cape, however, there may be some difference, again, because the 16-inch shells hit a little bit harder while flying at a slightly different angle and will penetrate just that little bit deeper. So it's possible that Scharnhorst might be overwhelmed and crippled and then sunk a bit earlier in her game, but again, manifestly doesn't actually change the outcome itself. It is the slightly odd thing of World War II that battleship engagements are so few and far between and usually so disproportionate that although a lot of internet time is made about, having 14, 15 or 16-inch guns, when you look at most of the engagements that occur, battleship versus battleship, where you could plausibly substitute one for the other, it doesn't actually tend to make a huge difference. As I said, maybe a couple of battles, the 16-inch guns might do just a little bit more damage, but doesn't change the overall outcome. And then the flip side, you look at something like Washington versus Hiroshima, whether Washington's armed with triple 16s or quad 14s isn't going to make the slightest iota of difference for Hiroshima. In fact, it might even accelerate Hiroshima's demise a bit because you have even more holes in her. Clemen Gradinia, I think, asks, Were there enough gunners to man every cannon on an age of sail ship, or were there just enough to cover only one side, port or starboard, at a time? And what did gunners do when they weren't manning the guns? Were they training, doing maintenance, helping running the ship, etc.? And what about in boarding actions? Generally speaking, when gunners weren't manning the guns, they were helping run the rest of the ship. Bearing in mind that a ship's gunnery crew made up the majority by numbers of the complement of the ship, and so when it came to, dealing with the sails, keeping the ship clean, keeping the ship in good condition, and etc. and so forth, all of this would be done in part by the ship's gunnery crew. During boarding actions, normally a ship's gunnery crew would stay at their guns. Of course, if you're on your guns on the upper deck, you're going to get swept up in either the boarding action offensively or defending against one defensively, just the nature of where your post is. And very occasionally, gunners would, or parts of gun crews would be called up to take part in either attacking an enemy ship or defending your own ship, but that was somewhat rarer. For the most part, there were exceptions to that. But in terms of were there enough gunners to man every cannon in an age of sail ship, at the start of a battle, the answer is yes. So if you look at the typical gun crew for a ship, every person in the gun crew who has a stated role within that gun crew, you will find has a deputy or a backup, and sometimes multiple thereof. And that's because you actually, for most guns, can run them with 4 to 6 people, depending on the size. But even a 32-pounder, 6 people is more than adequate physical labour and, just numbers to actually crew and man the gun. But your average gun crew was 12, 14 or 16 strong, depending on the navy, depending on the gun. This was there partly to make the job easier by, many hands make light work, but also to absorb casualties. Because if you have let's say a 6-man gun crew, and you lose 2 of the men to splinters, well, now you can't operate that gun if it's a big one. Whereas if you have 14 men and you lose 2 to splinters, well, you still have a reserve of 4 before you start running into issues. But what this also meant was that if the ship was doubled, i.e. there was an enemy on either side, you could split your crew in half. So if you have a 14-man gun crew, you go, right, okay, 7 of us will stay here. The other 7, usually the 7 who are the backup to each position, you go over there, you fight that gun. And now the ship can fight both sides at once. Obviously, you then have, if you have 2 7-man teams, you only have 1 casualty per team before you start running into issues. Again, assuming we're using a 32-pounder as an example. But it can be, and was, frequently done. Chris Balance asks, on New Year's Eve 1942, HMS Scylla engaged and sank the German blockade runner MS Rakotis in the Bay of Biscay. How would Scylla have fared if the action was on New Year's Eve night and the blockade runner turned out to be a radar-equipped German auxiliary cruiser armed with 150mm guns and torpedoes similar to the Comet or Cormoran? Assuming the radar, like the Rakotis, had already been engaged by Coastal Command aircraft, so the commander of the Scylla knew he was dealing with a German ship, what would be the best tactics for Scylla? How would Scylla's radar figure into the night fight, and what range would its 4.5-inch guns and torpedoes need to be at to be effective? The moon was a waning crescent that night, but it's winter in the Bay of Biscay, so I'm sure the weather was lovely. So Scylla would have had radar, so she would have been able to use that in the night in order to detect, track and engage the German vessel. Now, whilst the German ship technically would have slightly heavier guns, the main difference between our merchant cruisers, our merchant raiders, etc., and full-fledged warships is actually the centralised fire control. At very close range, this doesn't make much odds, which is what was the doom of Sydney, but as long as Scylla keeps her range, the fact that she has slightly smaller guns in the form of 4.5s isn't going to make too much odds, especially at night, because if she can stay at least 5,000 yards plus range, which her radar should allow her to do, she can then use some of her secondary guns to fire star shell, which should dazzle any German optical range finding equipment, and she can just plug away with her 4.5-inch merrily until the German ship, which basically has no real armour to speak of, would end up, in serious problems. That being said, if she knows the identity of the ship in advance and she's able to use her radar to track the enemy vessel, then actually one of the better approaches might be to fire a spread of torpedoes first down the bearing, hope that you get some hits and move in to finish off with the 4.5-inch guns, and if you miss then you go in with the 4.5-inch guns regardless. So yeah, the torpedoes would have been effective, but between the radar and her fire control system, as long as Scylla's commander plays it smart, he should be able to quite easily overwhelm and sink an armed merchant cruiser or an auxiliary cruiser. Christopher Ryan asks, why are there only 2 access points to the turrets of the Iowas under the barbette magazines and the turret bustle? And was this common, or did some classes allow access through a higher deck? Basically, this is very common, actually. Having access points to your turret is a huge weak spot, especially if they're roof hatches. Why you'd have a roof hatch to a turret, I'm not entirely sure. It doesn't really serve any purpose. You'd have to get into really weird and awkward positions to use it, and if a shell hits the roof, well, as I said, a hatch in the roof is a weak spot, because unless you make it as thick as the rest of the roof armour, then you're going to have problems, and even if you do, well, the hinges are still a problem, and it's going to be very difficult and heavy to lift. Likewise, hatches in the sides of the turrets. Now, hatches in the side or back of a turret is a little bit more common, depending on the design of the turret, as opposed to the sort of going under the back of one of Iowa's turrets and then sort of popping up underneath. But usually most turrets would only have 1, maybe if you're lucky 2 access points, usually tucked around somewhere around the back, again because access points are a weakness. And then if you needed to get in and out during action, you could go down, as you mentioned, into the barbette and hope that there was an access out further down there, usually via the magazines or something. And the reason why you don't really have many accesses is basically, apart from the fact it's a weakness, as I mentioned, is that why would you need to use them? Because outside of some conning towers, the turrets are basically the single best protected parts of the ship. So, 1, again, it doesn't serve to introduce any weaknesses if you can avoid it. But 2, if you're in a turret and it gets hit hard enough that it gets penetrated and you have a reason to escape, nowhere else on the ship would have been well armoured enough to protect you. At which point, you might as well just have 1 or 2 access points and hope, because, you know, where else are you going to run that's going to help at that point? Rescues Greyhounds asks, I believe that in my childhood I heard of people packing utensils into canister rounds during the Age of Sail. Is this really true? And if so, which cannons were used to fire these rounds? Moreover, were these rounds packed at the start of the battle, or did Nigel have to go around finding all the forks, spoons and knives before packing the canisters? On a more serious note, if the sailors knew their ship was going to be a prize, did they ever spike the guns or cannons so that they couldn't be used to fight other friendly ships in the area? The answer on the canister shot is, generally speaking, no. Now, there are cases where people were incredibly desperate and did occasionally pack the odd utensil in a kind of improvised canister shot. However, it was almost universally not the case for a few reasons. 1, as you can see, canister shot came pre-packed. So unless you're completely out of it and literally every other kind of onboard shot, there is no reason to try and make up your own. Secondly, lead balls are far, far more lethal and effective when used as a canister shot than a bunch of relatively lightweight cutlery, which is going to have terrible aerodynamics apart from anything else. And third, cutlery would have been insanely valuable compared to what it is today. Now, these days, you might not think too much of shoving, the $5 cutlery set that you happen to have lying around down the barrel of a gun and sending it downrange if you have to. But back then, cutlery would have been one of the few personal possessions that a sailor owned. This wasn't kind of standard issue cutlery given to you by the Royal Navy for the most part. This would have been stuff you'd bought yourself, you'd brought on board. It was your only cutlery set a lot of the time. The idea of having multiple knives and forks, etc., in drawers like we have today is very much a modern thing. Well, they had them back in those days as well, but they're mostly for the rich. So you might have your own personal cutlery set that you'd spent a reasonable amount of money on, and that might be it. You might have a spare knife, something like that, but if somebody was, let's say, doing the rounds, going, you know, lads, we need to absolutely just throw everything we've got back at the enemy, actually, of all things, your cutlery would be one of the very last things you'd want to put into a canister shot. You would literally be searching the deck for splinters of wood, bits of cannonball, musket balls, random bits of smaller bits of ballast stone, breaking up your own mess deck, mess tables, etc., long before you'd want to be using cutlery. Heck, even the carpenter might be persuaded to part with a few buckets of nails for canister shot. So yeah, unfortunately, it remains pretty much just a Pirates of the Caribbean thing for the most part. As for if people knew their ship was going to be a prize, did they spike the guns? Very occasionally. But one, the equipment for spiking guns is not exactly very common aboard ships, and two, you've got to remember as well that a lot of what was going on when it came to surrender, capture, boarding it was very much predicated on the honour system. So if you surrendered, you were expected to offer no further resistance and do nothing further that might prejudice the enemy from the point that you had surrendered. So in theory, I suppose, yes, you might have the captain who would say, right, everyone, spike your guns. You spike the guns with whatever tools you happen to have available to do so, and then you surrender. But given that most naval officers absolutely hated the idea of surrender, that additional time would not be something they would have. If they came to a point where they were going to surrender, it would be because it was basically that will be blown off the face of the planet in the next 10 seconds. So once you have honourably surrendered, you don't do the dishonourable thing of then subsequently sabotaging your ship unless you want your enemies to turn around and say, oh, okay, you're breaking the commonly understood terms of surrender. Right, well, I guess it's curtains for the lot of you then. So yeah, not really a common practice. And to be honest, if you're fighting something like France or Spain, or if you're French or Spanish fighting the British, both sides have more than enough cannon. It's not going to make really any odds. Jellicoe Cats Gets Confused at Night asks, while I was touring USS Little Rock on June the 6th, hi, by the way, nice to meet you, I struck up a conversation with one of the docents about the Hedgehog launchers on USS the Sullivans. I asked him how they were fired, and this has apparently been a topic of discussion amongst the museum staff as well. Were the Hedgehogs electrically, mechanically, or hydraulically fired, and were they fired remotely from a central location or by the crews directly manning the launchers? So the Hedgehogs actually are electrically fired. You can actually see one of the cables involved here just on the right there, and they could be fired from a remote station, or they could be fired from a shielded position just aft of the launcher. It does depend somewhat to an extent on what particular launcher you're using. Some of them can only be fired remotely, but on a decent number of them, the ability to fire them from the launcher itself is there. Now, they have a rather odd launching system in that the firing is done electrically, so it's an electrical fire circuit. However, what that electrical fire circuit does is it releases a manually primed spring firing pin. That then strikes the primer charge in the mortar round, which sends it flying off into the sky. And it's actually quite cleverly done because the recoil of the mortar charge firing actually has enough force that it resets the spring-loaded firing pin. So once you've set it the first time, you never have to reset it, because every time you launch a Hedgehog round, it will automatically reprime itself. Obviously, you double check when you're reloading. So yeah, it's kind of this combination electrically initiated, but at the very last stage, mechanical firing system to get the Hedgehog rounds up and away. Neil asks, How does the 5-inch 54 gun on Midway and planned to be used on the Montanas compare to the 5-inch 38s in the anti-air, anti-surface trade-off? So the only two weaknesses of the 5-inch 54 compared to the 5-inch 38 in the anti-air role was, one, the theoretical upper maximum rate of fire was very slightly less, and secondly, because the round and the propellant cartridge were a little bit heavier, the crews could be fatigued quicker, so their rate of fire might drop off faster, for example. And of course, with the longer barrel, as you can see, they had to be spaced out slightly further, so you could have slightly fewer of them. But other than that, they were actually very comparable with the 5-inch 38 in most circumstances. They could elevate and train pretty much as fast. The average rate of fire was about the same. Obviously, they could have VT fuses, etc. And a lot of that was down to the fact that by the time you get to the era of the 5-inch 54, you have full RPC or remote power control in place, and it hasn't been in place for a while in the US Navy, but it's now a fully mature technology. So a lot of the concerns around longer gun barrels being slower to handle, etc., as compared to the shorter ones in the 5-inch 38, no longer do those concerns apply in the immediate post-war environment, because the fully powered turret or gun mounting has actually taken a lot of those issues and pretty much done away with them within reason. But in the anti-air role, in a positive, the 5-inch 54 could reach out further and its muzzle velocity was higher, so the shell got there slightly quicker, which made everybody's job a lot easier. In the anti-surface role, there was a huge range advantage to the 5-inch 54. At maximum elevation, well, at maximum reasonable elevation for a surface engagement, i.e. 45 degrees, you could go over 8,000 yards further with a 5-inch 54 compared to a 5-inch 38. And although the range difference decreased the lower the elevation went, you were still talking about 2,000 to 3,000 yards comfortably longer range, and therefore flatter trajectory, better armor piercing, etc., etc., with the 5-inch 54 as compared to the 5-inch 38. So in the anti-air role, it was kind of swings and roundabouts. There were a few very minor trade-offs, but a few small gains as well. And in the anti-surface role, it was a massive step up, albeit that whether or not you needed a 5-inch anti-surface gun in the first place at all in the immediate post-war environment was another issue. Reaver asks, much was made pre-World War II about the balance of roles in dual-use destroyer and larger ship secondary gunnery, the US 5-inch 38 being a famous example of a good gun, albeit one that emphasised the air defence role at some small cost to surface warfare, whilst the British had a long run of guns that struggled at air defence in part due to the desire for better anti-surface performance. My question is, while we certainly have plenty of examples where dual-purpose weapons that sacrificed AA performance ultimately failed against air attack to disastrous effect, was the reverse ever true? Were there cases where forces with anti-aircraft optimised guns suffered in an engagement where having a more surface-oriented weapon might have made a difference? It is a bit of a difficult question to answer, because when you look at the 5 major navies involved in the conflict, the British, as you mentioned, had a slightly more anti-surface balance to their destroyer-grade guns. The Germans definitely had an anti-surface balance to the extent a good number of their earlier destroyer-based guns physically weren't capable of anti-aircraft work at all. The Italians, neither here nor there, depends on the exact weapon, to be honest, but again, slight balance towards the anti-surface engagement role. The Japanese definitely, although ostensibly having dual-purpose guns, they're definitely much better anti-surface weapons than they are AA weapons. And even for the short time that they were involved in the war, the French also primarily an anti-surface gun. The only destroyers who have a gun that is more oriented for anti-aircraft than anti-surface work is the American destroyers. Now, you do have various dedicated anti-air only secondary batteries on some ships, but they tend not to play so much of an important role in surface engagement. So basically, you're left looking at American destroyers armed with the 5-inch 38 and how they performed. Now, that's not to say that there are American destroyer performances that were somewhat subpar in terms of damage dealt out versus damage inflicted by the enemy, There certainly were engagements where American destroyers came off worse. Well, most of the Guadalcanal battles for a start. But unfortunately for this kind of analysis, it's difficult to unpick the gun performance from the rest of the issues, especially the issues surrounding night fighting, because you can point to, Japanese destroyers getting the better of American destroyers in a number of different night engagements, again, especially around Guadalcanal and a few battles later on. However, whether or not that's directly a result of the Japanese having somewhat better guns for an anti-surface engagement, and how much of that is a result of them just having superior night fighting tactics and technology, it's a difficult one to work out, because when you look at some night engagements between British and Italian or British and German destroyers, in a number of those cases, ostensibly the Axis destroyer would have a gun that is actually better suited for anti-surface engagement, especially some of the heavier guns of some of the German destroyers, but they'd still lose the engagement because even though they had smaller guns and theoretically less capable weapons, the British had other advantages, including their superior night fighting tactics and technology. So I would say, yes, it is possible that in some of those early engagements, the difference in capabilities between the destroyer's main batteries made a difference, but it's going to be layered in so many other elements involved in those engagements that it's going to actually be very difficult to work out which one is the primary issue. Wayland Chow asks, if the Luftwaffe tried their own version of Operation Starvation against the UK in World War II instead of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, how would this have affected the Battle of the Atlantic? So for those of you not aware, Operation Starvation was an extensive mine-laying program in Japanese home waters undertaken by B-29s towards the end of the war that was fairly successful. Now, as far as the Luftwaffe trying out their own version in 1940, the short answer is they did try, except it didn't work out quite as well. There are quite a few reasons for this. I mean, the German magnetic mines they dropped early on did work out fairly well for them, at least until degaussing methods could be worked in. However, the problem that the Luftwaffe faced compared to Operation Starvation is that Britain actually still had a functioning anti-aircraft defence network, including extensive numbers of fighters, so a heavily laden bomber wandering around with a bunch of parachute-dropped sea mines was considerably more vulnerable to attack than the B-29s were off of Japan. Secondly, was the Luftwaffe didn't have anywhere near as many aircraft to hand as the Americans did, and obviously a Heinkel 111 or a Dornier 17 is far less capable in payload than a B-29 as well. So they couldn't physically get as many mines over the UK as the US Army Air Force could. Then you've also got the fact that, okay, yes, Japan is a very densely populated nation, but Britain is even more insanely densely populated, which meant that when the Luftwaffe dropped mines off of the British coast, very often people would see where they'd dropped the mines, which made mine hunting somewhat easier. And that's another factor. The British actually had quite an active mine hunting unit, or many mine hunting units, which meant that quite a lot of mines that were deployed could go and be swept pretty quickly. Whereas again, with the Japanese, one, they didn't have a particularly extensive mine hunting unit set in their navy in the first place, and B, by 1945, they very definitely didn't have many of them left. So it was much harder for them to sweep those mines. Now, with all that being said, could the Luftwaffe have done more? Well, yes, in theory, if they dispatched bombers to do mine laying only instead of attacking various cities and airfields, then they could have deployed more mines, but it would have also meant that the RAF would have had undamaged airfields, uncontested airfields, and unattacked cities, which would have meant they could have concentrated pretty much the entirety of their fighter defence efforts on stopping incoming German aerial mine layers. And of course, they've got radar to do so. You can't really do low altitude mine drops, so it would have been very difficult for the Germans to accomplish much more than they historically did. So basically, the short version is the Germans did try their own version. it just wasn't successful for a whole host of reasons that involve the geography and the military setup of the UK at the time. Dr. Irrelevant asks, how would the naval aspect of World War I change if the Royal Navy and Imperial German Navy swapped radio practices, i.e. the Imperial German Navy now uses radio only strictly when necessary and at the weakest power settings, whilst the Royal Navy uses the radio for everything and always at full power? Now, this has some rather odd positive and negative effects once you think through it for the Royal Navy and the Kaiserliche Marine. On the one hand, if Kaiserliche Marine transmissions are taking place far less frequently and they are much harder to pick up, then that makes Room 40's job a lot harder. So the British are far less likely to have actionable intelligence about exactly what the Germans are doing on any given day, which makes the occurrence of some battles that relied on Room 40 data, like Jutland and Dogger Bank, somewhat less likely. And it means the British are going to be slightly more vulnerable to German bait-and-switch techniques, which obviously overall is a net positive for the Germans because they're operating under better operational security and they're less predictable to the British. But the flip side is that when it comes to the actual engagements, if the British are now firm adopters of we must use radios for everything and anything and we must blast everything out at full power, then bizarrely, on a tactical level, the Royal Navy probably actually does slightly better than historical. Because, yes, the battles may not take place in the first place, and the battles may not take place in exactly the way they did historically, but if we assume that something vaguely similar to Dogger Bank or Jutland takes place, and let's face it, we kind of have to for this scenario, because otherwise we might as well just write our hands off and go, well, we don't know what the naval war in World War I's going to look like now. Then we have situations where, for example, BT signalling is screwed up when the battlecruiser fleet turns south to face off against first scouting group. That's done by flags. If the Royal Navy is, all radio all the time, all power, then 5th Battle Squadron is probably going to get a backup radio order telling them what to do. So the Queen Elizabeth probably don't end up lagging behind the battlecruiser fleet, which changes the balance of the run to the south immensely. Likewise at Dogger Bank, when BT orders the concentration of force, accidentally ends up ordering a concentration of force on Blucher, when he actually wants one ship, probably New Zealand, to focus on finishing off Blucher and the rest to chase off after the rest of the German ships, then you get, again, at that point Lion may not have its radio set, but if it did have its radio set still intact, then they'd be able to clarify their orders rather than, lose the opportunity, although exactly what may have happened in the aftermath of that is a matter of some debate. And then obviously you also have, why didn't anybody speak to Jellicoe at night when they had an idea where the German fleet was going? Well, if everybody is determined to blast out maximum strength radio signals at the drop of a hat, Jellicoe probably will know where the German fleet is going, and so there can be a follow-up engagement to Jutland the following morning. So, weirdly, on a grand strategy level, the British fleet is disadvantaged because they don't know as much about what's going on, but tactically, on a very, very fine scale, once something does happen, they actually are more likely to, square the circle of some of the mistakes that were made historically, which should, in theory, lead to a better outcome. Bay Reese asks, I heard somewhere online that the reason why most, if not all, US battleships were posted in the Atlantic in the very late 19th and early 20th centuries was due to a supposed threat from Germany. Was this true, and if so, was it justified? If not, what was a more realistic threat to US sea power in 1900 through 1910? It wasn't necessarily a threat from Germany per se as the main driver, although towards the end of this period, the Kaiserliche Marine, or possibly the Kaiser more so than the Navy, came up with a rather interesting plan, apropos completely of nothing, on how to defeat the US in a naval war, which primarily involved, if you can believe it, loading up a bunch of liners with the professional German army, which would have been a fairly major threat considering the US had barely had an army in the late 1910s that late 1900s, early 1910s, which is the time period that this was being considered for. And yes, I know you had the Spanish-American War and everything, but compared to the size of the German professional army, this was not really a thing. Anyway, and the idea was to concentrate them all up into this big troop convoy and sail them with the high seas fleet in a massive, overwhelming attack on New York, to occupy New York, which, regardless of exact numbers of total troops available in the continental United States, probably would have worked, because wherever US troops are, they weren't in New York in massive numbers. The only, and it is a fairly major flaw in this plan, was the idea that this somehow would win a war. Now, part of it, the idea that the US Navy would have to show up to defend New York, was, that was logical, and okay, the high seas fleet probably could have defeated them. They had more battleships apart from anything else. But then what? The plan seemed to assume that if you put 200,000-300,000 professional German troops into an occupation of New York and the surrounding area, that the Americans would therefore acknowledge that they'd lost. There wasn't any follow-up campaign to take the rest of the East Coast or anything like that. So even when everybody else saw that plan, they were just like, yeah, that's a fantastic plan to take New York. What else are you planning on doing? And then everyone kind of looked at each other and went, oh, you need a follow-up plan? We never heard of this thing before, which is bizarre, given that virtually all other major German military plans had extensive follow-up plans built into them, which is why, as I say, it was probably more of the Kaiser's idea than the Kaiserliche Marine's idea. Nonetheless, that aside, and the fact that not too many people took it that seriously, the simple fact of the matter was that in the latter part of the 19th century and then going into the early 20th century, pretty much every major potential problem for the US in naval terms would be coming at the East Coast. Yes, the Japanese Navy existed, but no one seriously thought they would be able to reach the Pacific coast anytime soon. If they went after US holdings after the Spanish-American War, i.e. the Philippines, well, that's what the Asiatic Squadron or the Asiatic Fleet, depending on exactly what time period you're looking at, was there for. And also bearing in mind at this point, the Panama Canal did not exist. So if you had a significant force based on the West Coast, well, one, there weren't that many significant naval bases on the West Coast for it to be based out of in the first place, but two, even if there were, if somebody went after if, say, the Japanese went after US holdings in the Western Pacific, it would take forever and a day to get from the West Coast to those holdings, so why bother? And if somebody went after US holdings on the East Coast or in that area, which was far more likely, considering, as I said, that every other major navy that might be considered a threat was on the other side of the Atlantic and could cross the Atlantic or had colonial holdings in places like the northern coast of South America and the Caribbean. So, those are a much more bigger, much more immediate, much more likely threat, and a US West Coast based force would take months to get around South America to get up and help fight, which is what happened with USS Oregon in the Spanish-American War. Therefore, it made far, far, far more sense to base the vast majority of the US Navy on the East Coast. The infrastructure was there, the majority of the threats were there, and if something really, big kicked off in the Western Pacific, it was actually probably just about as quick and just about as efficient to send ships from the East Coast via the Suez Canal through the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean to get to the Western Pacific than it was to send them all the way around South America and then across the Pacific. So it made the most sense for what the US Navy was facing at the time. Bearing in mind, obviously, at the very start of the 20th century, you had the Spanish-American War with one of the smaller navies of Europe. So, you could be fighting anybody. Eric J. Van Dooting asks, in Shattered Sword, the account of Hiryu's first counterstrike has the attack launched approximately 30 minutes after the end of the US dive bomber attack. Then, 35 minutes after their launch, the Zeros abandoned the dive bombers they were escorting to attack a group of Enterprise SBDs that they spotted below, which had serious consequences on the number of VALs which would survive the attack on Yorktown. My question is, how was the Japanese flight able to overtake the returning dive bombers so quickly, given that they were behind by 30 minutes flying time? There is some hint in the text that the returning US planes had some navigational issues and may not have taken a direct course back to their carriers. So there's a couple of factors involved. Hiryu obviously escaped the initial attack because she was slightly further to the north in the first place, and the US carriers were kind of northeast, maybe north by northeast. So although Hiryu wasn't in the direct line of flight for the SBDs heading home, she was, 15, 20 miles, possibly further north than the Akagi and Kaga, which of course were the major ones that got hit. So that gave her a small degree of advantage for her aircraft in terms of a head start. It's not much, but even assuming that the SBDs, upon dropping their bombs, immediately turned and headed directly for Yorktown, which is not what's going to happen, that still cuts about 10 minutes off of the sensible half-hour lead that the SBDs enjoyed. Next, you have the fact that, once you've done your dive bombing run on the various Japanese ships, as I said, the SBDs don't just immediately pull up and head loosely individually back home. They have to form up, check who's survived, get out of the immediate engagement zone, because obviously various Japanese ships will still be firing on them, and then once they've done all of that, they will head back to the carriers. Now that might not take too long, but given that, as you mentioned, there's a sort of a 30-minute window between the attacks on the Japanese carriers and this engagement between Hiryu's fighters and Enterprise's SBDs, and you're already down kind of a 10 minutes or so just because Hiryu's further north, well, if you lose another 5 to 10 minutes in the form-up and head home, you're now actually only about 10 minutes apart. And then factor in that the SBDs will be, obviously, as part of that, they'll be navigating on a slightly dogleg course in order, they'll be heading more east first and then north, or possibly west and then north, but basically they're not going to be flying over. They're going to be flying north over the majority of the Japanese fleet, so that's going to extend their journey time a little bit. And, of course, they're going to be travelling at cruising speed, and the economical cruising speed of an SBD that's trying to get home and conserve its fuel over distance is slightly lower than the cruising speed of a Val dive bomber that's fully loaded and going for broke. Now, ostensibly, the cruising speed of both aircraft is about 180, 190 miles an hour, but a returning SBD flight would be throttling back slightly more than that once they've cleared the immediate danger zone, as I said, in order to conserve fuel and make sure they actually do get home, whereas Hiryu's flight was almost entirely concerned with just getting there and attacking as fast as humanly possible, so they may even have been travelling slightly faster than their cruising speed, and of course the cruising speed of a 0 is higher still. So factor in that, and all of a sudden that last kind of 10-minute-ish lead that the SBDs might have enjoyed would be almost entirely eaten up very quickly by the slightly faster travelling Japanese formations. And then, of course, when they spot the SBDs ahead, then the Zeros go full power and close that last bit of distance. Sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning asks, the US 5-inch 38 came in a ridiculous variety of mounts for US destroyers, which might be a topic for a dedicated video someday, but a lot of tin cans prior to the Fletcher class would use different mounts on the same ship, with fully enclosed gun houses on the forward mounts and either shielded, canvas-topped, shielded open-topped, or fully open mounts for some or all of the aft guns. Going even further back, the Farragut's had shielded guns forward and open mounts aft, and the four-stackers had a shield for the forward 4-inch gun only. What was the deal between these mix and match arrangements? Was there a tactical or engineering consideration in play, or did they just reward the better gunners' mates with splinter protection while the less favoured ones had to take their chances stopping shrapnel with a cotton shirt? Well, yeah, it's definitely a thing. Here's USS Bagley, for example, with 2 shielded mounts forward and 2 unshielded mounts aft. Now, the reason for this is a combination of weather and weight. Basically, even having an open or an enclosed mount could be a make or break difference when it came to destroyer weight calculations. Indeed, when you look at the developmental history of the Fletchers, for example, the arguments back and forth about how many guns you're going to have, and if you were going to have so many guns, then how many should be shielded and how many should be unshielded, you know, it's a fairly dominant part of the actual argument that eventually results in the Fletcher that we all know and love. And at first, there were things like, well, we can have this torpedo launcher set up, or this displacement setup, or this number of guns, but only if we have 3 guns unshielded. If we have all the guns shielded, then we have to lose a gun, and things like this. So when it came to the very, very fine tolerances of destroyer tonnage allowances, this was basically the case of, you know, if we want a 4-gun ship, then we need to have as many of them unshielded as possible to save as much weight as possible. The reason why the shielded mounts are almost invariably the forwardmost mounts is because, of course, ships generally travel forward, and a destroyer being a relatively small warship means it's going to kick up a huge amount of water when it's travelling at speed, and therefore the forward guns are more likely to have water coming green over them much, much more often than the aft guns are. So if you've only got the displacement to shield 1 or 2 guns, you shield the forward ones first, and the aft guns just have to live with it because they're far less likely to be flooded out all the time. And that's basically the primary reasoning behind both the fact that you have some unshielded guns and why the shielded ones are in the places that they are. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. And I say this week's because, as I mentioned earlier, and I've mentioned in various other previous videos, not been particularly well, so I can only do this much Drydock this week. So next week you will get the other half of the Drydock, and then regular Drydocks for the 2 weeks that remain thereafter, and then hopefully everything will be back to normal with October. And I do have a couple of Drydock live streams to catch up on later in the month as well. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and see you again in another video.